English translation, 727th contact. Part 1. Friday, the 22nd of November 2019. 11 hours.
There you are waiting, my dear friend. But be welcome. Just had to do something, or I would have come over 10 minutes ago.
Thank you for your welcome, Edward, dear friend. Although I have been here for 20 minutes, I have not been bored because, as you have allowed me, I have looked up a few things on your computer and also found this new aphorism of the most recent date, which I find remarkably good.
Lost through beliefs, through any religious or other beliefs, the human being loses the reference to the sense and the view of perception, cognition, and understanding of real reality and truth. Sinyase Silver Star Center, November 22nd, 2019, 9:19 HRS, Billy.
Thank you. I appreciate your assessment.
Thank you, but now... Edouard, I have news to tell you that will probably amaze you as much as it did with me when I came across something of my father's in the now open library, which I will call the Secret Annals.
Aha, and if I may learn what Svath has written, then the question is how.
I want to talk about that, or rather reveal some things to you. My father recorded that you only had a religious education at school, where you got top marks for your good knowledge of religion. However, you were never a believer in God, but Father Zimmermann was before my father Svath came into contact with him, after which he was in any case no longer a believer in the sense of the Christian religion. You knew that, but the priest ordered you to keep quiet about it, because neither his family, who were and remained believers in the Bible, nor the authorities and the population were allowed to know anything about it, because his office as priest would have been endangered. When he felt called to become a pastor as a young man, he was very Bible-believing and God-believing, and he remained so until that time when my father contacted him. Particularly significant, which is now also clear and understandable to me, was the behavior of Pastor Zimmermann. Because it is clear from the secret annals that my father Svath contacted Pastor Zimmermann even before you started school in 1944, and not only through inspirations, but also personally. That he then brought him back to Emmanuel during a 2-day time journey when he was 28 years old and was also able to speak with him via a language converter. You never told me anything about that. Just as you never told me that you had already traveled back in time twice with my father before your journey with Ascot and were able to speak with Emmanuel, as well as with all the other earlier prophets. This experience, however, that Pastor Zimmermann was able to talk to Emmanuel and came to know the reality and thus the falseness of his religious faith, caused him to change his belief in the Bible and God. Consequently, his faith very quickly changed to an acknowledgement of reality. However, this could not stop him from continuing to exercise his pastoral ministry, but henceforth in a different way, for which his reason was the need to teach his Bible-believing congregation that which conditions true humanity. And as I said in my...
Excuse me, I had no idea about that, because Svath never told me. I am really gobsmacked there, really. The fact that Svath was in personal contact with Reverend Zimmermann and that he even went back to Emmanuel with him, he never told me about that either, just as Reverend Zimmermann never told me. Svath, I think, would have told him that he must never speak about it, which he then perhaps understood to mean that he should also remain silent towards me. Svath never said anything to me about it either, so I could never say anything to you either. And as for my journeys back with Svath to all the other heralds, I was not allowed to say anything about it to you, Sinyase and Quetzal. For your father said that you in particular would learn the whole thing when the correct time came for it, which, however, would be when you gained knowledge of it through your own efforts.
Then I can understand that you have kept silent, which you are very good at. But I can also understand that you are very astonished at what my father is handing down with his Annals, thus revealing earlier incidents that you are not aware of, and that he has kept secret from you.
But why did he not tell me? I do not understand.
He must have had his reasons for that, but I have not found any justification for it in his annals so far. Now, however, continue to hear what other very interesting things I have learned from my father's explanations, whereby I assume that you have not been informed by my father Svath about various other incidents as well. Of these I will tell you again and again in the near future, of which, however, certain information will be intended for you alone, while others may be mentioned openly. Consequently, you may then, when recalling and writing down our conversations, mention only what is permitted.
That is obvious, yet you make me sore, my friend.
That may also be, Edward, because I am also with regard to the further information that I will still learn from my father's annals, from which, however, I have already been able to glean a lot of important information. I also understand the incident at the barn in the Erichfeld, when my father's flying apparatus was allowed to be seen and touched by the Count's teacher, which corresponded to a purpose and whereby your teacher received a mental inspiration from my father. This was directed towards Teacher Graff, confiding in his school colleague Teacher Lehman, according to his experience, and the urging whispered into him by my father, and also explaining to him that you would repeat the 4th grade with him because Teacher Frey would bully you, beat you, and put you back another year in the school grade. And as my father explained, he came to this solution because he realized through observation and looking into the future that Teacher Lehman was secretly preoccupied with astronomical findings and was thinking that human life could exist on Mars just as it did on Earth. He was very preoccupied with it because he had heard about a very realistically staged science fiction radio play in America called The War of the Worlds, which had been invented by an Orson Welles. This radio play, broadcast over the airwaves in America, aroused fear and panic among the population of the city of New York and also far and wide about an invasion from Mars. Teacher Lehman, however, did not believe that the Martian inhabitants could be malicious beings, just as he also did not take the radio play seriously. But he thought about the possibility, as I have already said, that human beings could actually live on Mars as they do on Earth. The two teachers, Graff and Lehman, then got together for a joint consultation and followed secret instructions that my father transmitted to them by inspiration, whereby Teacher Graff encouraged you in the 3 school years that you spent with him from the 1st to the 3rd grade. And since he was also a friend of Professor Jung, he also made an effort to put many of your questions concerning psychology to him, which he himself could not answer. He also let him in on everything that was going on, so this man was also very well informed about you, but he held back and did not talk about it openly, but only with Teacher Graff. But when it happened, because you had gone from the Matilda Escher home, where your mother was with your severely physically handicapped sister Verena, that you had gone down to the Berg-Holtzli clinic in Zurich, because my father ordered you to do so, as he also did with Professor Carl Gustav Jung, that your acquaintance came about, then the development began. That on the one hand, your 2 teachers, Graff and Lehman, as well as also Pastor Zimmermann, were contacted in person by my father, Svath, informed and variously enlightened and instructed. It also came about through Professor Jung that after his passing in 1961, towards the end of the 1970s, his niece Lou Zinsstag came to you, who dealt with the so-called UFO phenomenon that had arisen worldwide, which a man in America named Kenneth Arnold had raised as a result of observing flying objects unknown to him. This experience of Arnold's was fraudulently exploited by George Adamski, who lived in America and came from Poland by fraudulently claiming with lies that he was in contact with a woman from the planet Venus.
Note excerpt from Wikipedia. Kenneth A. Arnold was an American pilot and businessman. He became famous for his sighting of unidentified flying objects near Mount Rainier on the 24th of June, 1947, for which he first used the term flying saucer. On the 24th of June, 1947, Arnold claimed that while flying near Mount Rainier, Washington State, He saw 9 unusual flying objects in the clouds. He went on to say that he had timed them and estimated their speed at 1,200 miles per hour, around 1,900 kilometers per h. At first, he said he only recognized a kind of light balls until he got closer. The first reports described 8 objects as flat, plate-like discs, and 1 object as flat and bat-like or crescent-shaped. Although Arnold also refers to the objects as saucer-like discs and saucer-like objects in his own writing, such as a 1947 letter to the U.S. Air Force and a 1948 article in Fate magazine, Arnold later rejects the term flying saucer. In a 1950 radio interview, Arnold denies having meant the term saucer to describe appearance. He always described the objects as discs. The term flying saucers was a misunderstanding with the reporters. Adamski was the first contactee, that is to say, someone who publicly claimed to have encountered extraterrestrials. Before that, he appeared as a UFO spotter. Adamski wrote several books around his alleged meetings with Venusians, who were supposed to have taken him on interplanetary journeys. Some of his works became bestsellers, such as Flying Saucers Have Landed in 1953, which he co-wrote with Desmond Leslie. Even ufologists saw most of his work as fictional. Science fiction author Arthur C. Clarke wrote in his novel 3001, The Last Odyssey, that ufologists would suffer from Adamski's disease.
Lou Zinsstag then informed Wendell Stevens in America, who immediately came to you and also initiated Lee and Britt Elders, which then led to the Contact film being made. For a long time, more than an hour, you and Professor Jung talked together, during which you had to give him a lot of information, and he realized that everything Teacher Graff told him was true. So he decided to go along with everything your teacher asked him to do, but Professor Jung also only did it in secret, because he was not allowed to deal with it publicly either. When you returned to the Matilda Escher home, your mother asked you about your whereabouts, and you truthfully told her about your meeting with the professor and your conversation with him, which she took for granted. Your acquaintance, which my father Svath arranged, was only a small part of what he did, for he also did a lot with your 2 teachers, Karl Graf and Gustav Lehmann, which he also concealed from you. He ordered both of them to the barn in the Irakfeld, and ordered them together into his flying apparatus, which you call the Pear spaceship, in order to fly with them around the Earth and also around the Earth's moon during a flight lasting several hours, and to inform them about your mission. He further instructed both of them regarding the reality of creation as well as the falsity of religions, as he also informed them, as was the case with Pastor Zimmermann, that you would suffer terrible slander and be harassed by the school authorities, etc., throughout your school years and also for some time afterwards as a result of slander. My father also taught them how the falsity of religions and the faith of Earth humans came about. Through all the teachings, both teachers caused themselves, as was also the case with Reverend Zimmermann, to turn to the truth from then on and to be helpful to you in a secret way. However, they had to commit themselves to conceal their experience, their received teachings and information, as well as their task from the outside, and also that external forces such as would not be able to perceive anything, so it was incumbent upon all of them, the 2 teachers, as well as Pastor Zimmermann, to remain silent. Because on the one hand, they would have forfeited their reputation and their livelihood by making an announcement, and on the other hand, they would not have been able to provide the necessary help for you. But furthermore, also with regard to, this is a brief account of the events that occurred in connection with Pastor Zimmermann, Professor Jung, and your 2 teachers, Karl Graf and Gustav Lehmann. If I now also briefly address that which relates to the slander that I have mentioned, then that should be enough for today in this regard. What I have read in my father's annals however, tells of extremely unpleasant and fanatical behavior of Christian believers in the school authorities of your home parish, as well as of persons who were officials in the parish leadership. The Annals reveal facts in this respect which state that your hometown has been a place of strict Christian faith since ancient times and also at the time of your juveniles. In this respect, it is written, "The religious believing behavior of many of the population showed similarities to those of the Middle Ages, although different faiths were common, as you call such differences in each case." My father wrote about the fact that, however, when it came to harming a human being, all believers of all faiths joined together and formed themselves uniformly into a mob that would stop at nothing. It was the same in your youth when an intrigue was brought about against you, but it was all done surreptitiously and hidden from the outside world. The whole thing that was directed against you corresponded to an unscrupulous sectarianism led by a grouping of fanatically influenced different faiths, which had gathered together and was willing to leave no stone unturned in order to achieve its fixed goal. And as you know, it is the case that when Earth humans unite in an unfair cause and become a mob, whether in small groups or in large masses, they then become heedless beings who strike uncontrollably like wild monsters. Of course, everything that was directed against you was not in this way, but seen in proportion it was no different. For in the gathering that came about, it was a matter of forcing you down under all circumstances, because as an unbeliever you were an intolerable outsider and heretic who could not be tolerated. And the reason for this was because Pastor Zimmermann went to the school authorities and the community leaders to ask for protection for you, because you told him that a woman named Horacek often stalked you and threatened to beat you because you did not go to church or Sunday school. He felt that intervening with the authorities was the best way to help you because he did not want to get involved with the Methodist Association to which Mrs. My father recorded in the Annals that this woman knew from her landlady, from a Weitwetten Louisa Meier, whom you often helped and did work for in your spare time, that you had not been baptized. Nor did you believe in the Bible stories or in a God, etc., as well as that you did not go to Sunday school or attend church. As a devout Methodist, the woman became angry and fell into hatred against you. When Pastor Zimmermann went to the school board and the church leadership in the hope that they would issue a warning against Mrs. Horacek, the opposite happened. This was because an intrigue was hatched against you out of religious faith, which always corresponds to a delusion. There were 4 influential men in the community leadership and school authorities who were fundamentally responsible for everything that was devised against you and maliciously done against you out of fanatical religious delusion. 2 of the men, namely, and were strict Catholics, another belonged to the Evangelical Brethren Church, and the 4th was a fanatically religious member of the Methodist Church and also acquainted with the Methodist Mrs. Horacek. It was also these 2 whom my father Schwath names in his Annals as the basic cause of the whole thing, that the 2 of them together devised to harass you in the hope that you would seek help in the Methodist faith and its God. Which is why she often shouted at you that you as an unbeliever should turn to the dear God. And it was also these 2 persons who were able to convince 4 strictly religious persons belonging to Pro Juventud that this organization should take action against your family and place all the children in homes or send them to live in pauperism. These persons were a man who belonged to the Baptist Church and 3 women, one of whom was a believer in Christ from the Salvation Army, the other 2 belonged to the Baptist Church. These persons of the Pro Juventud, however, were then, as father recorded in the Annals, threateningly attacked by your mother with a wooden club and chased from the place, after which these people intervened with the authorities, but could not achieve anything regarding their intention, at least not against your brothers and sisters, which is why they, like all the others, concentrated on you. In the course of time, all the persons who had been indignant against you came together and formed an alliance, In addition, the leading force of the Methodist congregation was joined by, consequently, the fanatical members of the authorities, and all the others were also supported by this side. And so it came about that against you and your unbelief an underhanded intrigue could be brought about with all possible means to convert you. And that then the woman whom you only called Horat or Horatine was ultimately the last reason that everything could turn out as planned, that then simply came about as providence. This woman, my father noted, was already fundamentally of the confused, fanatical delusion that she had to bring you into the Methodist Church at all costs, and save you from hell, and consequently bring you to her faith. And that she was then paid just as lavishly for this by the aforementioned members of the authorities and the Methodist leadership, as was also Teacher Frey, who was involved in everything to defame you, to keep you from your unbelief, and to make your unbelief more difficult in order to lead you to faith. Greed for money also played an important part in this. The fact is that you did not allow yourself to be affected by all this intrigue, Gewalt, and coercion. So in the end, they let you be oppressed by the woman and teacher Frey. And this they did in every conceivable way in an insidious manner, by hindering, restraining, and trying to deter you from your unbelief by harassment, lies, and slander. This is because the fanatical belief in the Bible and God, which is deeply rooted in the persons, drove them to it, just as such a fanatical delusion of faith also drove earth humans in medieval times to force believers in God to believe or to persecute them to the point of murder. When all the fanatics failed to achieve what they wanted, they began to act in such a way that Mrs. Horacek stalked you more and more and harassed you, while Teacher Frey became more and more angry with you and hit you more and more often because you still did not react in the way they had hoped. As Father wrote, you stood in everyone's way in such a way that they could not find their own inner satisfaction, and therefore you had become a heavy burden for them, which they wanted to get rid of again. Therefore, it was decided that you were inconvenient and unbearable, and they intended to exclude you from society in some way. And it came to this when Mrs. Horacek hit you with a wet cloth. You snatched it from her and hit her back, whereupon she complained to the relevant members of the authorities involved in the whole intrigue, which then set the whole thing in motion. What Father wrote further on this is the following. The Protestant teacher Frey was acquainted with various persons, so also with the fanatically Catholic members of the authorities, so that they encouraged him and gave him large sums of money to put you at a disadvantage in class, and also to persuade you to believe in the Bible and God. This, according to Father's Annals, he also often did, imploring and urging you to go to church or to the Methodists. But you never reacted to this and also never told anyone about it or complained. You also kept silent to your parents and brothers and sisters, as well as about the fact that he often beat you with a heavy stick in the face of all the pupils, not one of whom would have dared to say anything. The wife was also paid large sums of money, as was Teacher Frey, as I have already mentioned, to harass you more and more often, because everyone hoped that you would thereby seek help from God, from the Methodist Church, or from Catholicism, which Teacher Frey was supposed to convey to you in every conversation. This was the case when he made you stay behind in the classroom after school and forced you to listen to his attempts at persuasion. In time, however, out of anger, he also began to beat you when you were alone with him in the schoolroom, because you stood up to him and you did not change your mind of your disbelief in his favor. He could not bear this, which is why he beat you more and more often. When everything he did not work and you stopped attending school more and more often, which led to 172 absences, he, as well as the members of the authorities, the persons of the sex, the pro-juventud, and the evil-minded Mrs. Horacek, who was constantly stalking you and who also lived in Niederflachs and in your vicinity, got together and worked out plans to force you to believe by all kinds of Gewalt and attempts at coercion. When the woman then lay in wait for you and deliberately beat you with a wet cloth and you defended yourself, the reason was created to denigrate you as an uneducable person and to find a way to remove you from parental supervision. This resulted in all the suffering and evil that you had to experience, against which your mother and father could do nothing, because they were unable to do anything against the decisions and orders of the authorities. And as my father wrote, all those involved were full of hatred against you in their religious fanaticism and endeavored to drive you by intrigues, lies, beatings, as well as slander into a state which should lead you to a faith in the Bible and God. These events were additionally presented by the two members of the authorities to all other members of the authorities in a lying, completely false and defamatory manner, as a result of which the decisions that were to your disadvantage were made and implemented. And in this lying and slanderous manner, therefore, also thoroughly and completely untruthful files were prepared, and you were accused of things that never existed. And this also continued several times in your later life, as also with regard to the events with your elder sister's husband, who accused you together with his fellow thieves of shameful deeds, with which you had nothing to do, but which led back altogether to their criminal activities, for which, however, you had to pay innocently, while all three others remained unpunished or were punished leniently. The fact that you were the one who suffered, because you kept silent about the accusations against you and did not even defend yourself, because you wanted to protect your sister and her children, honored you, but it also caused you great damage to your reputation and unjustified punitive measures. The court also took into account the events in your hometown of Bulak, which, through the lies and slander of the municipal officials, and as well as the members of the school authorities, and as well as teacher Frey, Mrs. Horacek, the pro-Juventute members and the Methodists, and led to a great deal of evil being done to you. The fact that the lies and slander against you were then also recorded in writing in the corresponding files was just as disgraceful as it is today. Also because all this defamation and the whole web of lies is being passed on to you and also continued through insults, lies, and slander in the form of state-run fiches. Note Billy, probably still also in the new millennium. This is also because the fallible members of the municipal and school authorities in your home municipality had recorded and kept all the defamations and mendacity against you in writing, completely contrary to the truth and reality. The courts also made use of this when you were slanderously accused by your brother-in-law and his cronies of evil deeds, which, however, they had committed together. Your brother-in-law, however, who was a German citizen, promptly went back to Germany, thereby evading trial and punishment, while his two criminal cronies falsely accused you of being the ringleader and you were innocently punished. In my opinion, how I view and judge the whole matter in this respect surpasses everything in earth human sectarian insidiousness, infamy and base depravity to force a young human being into a religious sectarian faith in such a way. And what I have gleaned in this respect from my father's secret annals is word for word the same as all the explanations I have heard in this way from your companion Asket, but could not understand everything. Asket herself was inconsolable at that time in the 1950s when she followed all the happenings and could do nothing about them. For the time being, Edouard, dear friend, these are some of the many facts that I have learned from my father's secret annals, and that Asket has also confirmed. However, one important question leaves me no peace, for I cannot understand how you managed to get through what I consider to be the impossible, namely how you were able to remain the human being that you are in terms of mind and duty. How can you remain unchanged until the present time as you became the human being you are also today through the instruction of my father Svath? and through your untiring learning at a very young age. I am also left with the question of how you were able to come through everything psychologically unscathed, and how you never deviated from your promise. How you promised my father that you would fulfill your mission of consecration under all circumstances.
Thank you. What you told me is all strong tobacco, and I really did not know about that because Svath did not tell me. Well, so what? But you know, Ptah. On the one hand, there have been earthlings misled by faith from the earliest times, as well as those shaped by hate, and so it is still today, because since time immemorial only a few human beings have found their way out of their hateful behavior, unfortunately. And that in Buli and also in Niederflachs a fanaticism of faith almost like in the Middle Ages prevailed, that I experienced enough in my youth. And what was done to me by the delusion of faith and the hatred of various faith maniacs and, moreover, for the purpose of imposing a faith in a God and Savior, that I silently accepted at that time, especially for the sake of my mission, and also kept silent about it against everyone, even towards my parents, siblings, and the teachers Graf and Lehman. Only to Pastor Zimmermann did I once say something in a bright minute, specifically with regard to the Horiton. But then, as you know from the Annals of Svath, as you say, everything came out badly, because he intervened there, where then even more work was done against me. But you cannot blame him for that, because he certainly only meant well, and besides, he certainly did not expect what then came out of it. When I kept silent at the time, I thought that I could end up in the devil's kitchen if I complained or said anything else. And that anyone would have believed me. That was doubtful anyway, as it has remained so all my life and is still the case today, since with regard to the photos of your beam ships and the contacts with you, I am publicly slandered on television, in newspapers and journals as a liar, cheat, film and photo faker, and as a work-shy and evil human being and accused of living a life of glory and joy at the expense of our association members. That to this day I am not left alone with insults, through lies and slander, as well as that they would prefer to get rid of me, as has been attempted so far through 23 assassination attempts, and in the process, core group members have also been endangered, as well as Wendell Stevens, who stood or sat close to me during such attacks. These are incontrovertible facts.
Yes, that is unfortunately so. Even through your younger son and your divorced wife, you are being shamefully defamed, along with irresponsible ignoramuses who unthinkingly believe them and thereby spread hearsay lies, slander, and doubts about you worldwide without understanding or reasoning themselves. And the two of them, your youngest son and your former wife, defame you against their better judgment, because both of them could testify to incidents they themselves have experienced regarding sightings and sounds concerning our flying apparatus, like even a personal encounter between your divorced wife and me. I cannot understand such disgracefulness as these two display and can only judge it as depravity. And as for the lies and defamation concerning the fact that you were called a work-shy person and a sect leader, as it emerges, among other things from the official fiches which you requested and which I was able to read, that corresponds to such infamous lies and slander of the highest order that anger rose up in me. When I think of the immeasurable work you have done in rebuilding the entire center, which originally was more than just completely dilapidated and partly completely destroyed in terms of buildings and terrain, but out of which you have created a small paradise as the main laborer and with all your knowledge of the trade.
Please do not do that, because you do not have to exaggerate. If it had not been for all the other members, all the women and men and also the children, the whole thing would never have come about. Also with regard to the financial problems, some helped out and did not want to pay back the deposits, namely Elsie, Bernadette, Guido, and Engelbert, while with Amata, Renato, Micho, and Margaret, the loans had to be paid back. And the fact is also that every single core group member, as well as friends and passive members, have worked tremendously hard and given their best to the best of their ability. Otherwise, we would not have achieved what we can present to the world today. That pleases the truth, Ptah.
That is probably correct and also not to be disputed, but I now want to and must point out clearly and unequivocally whereby I must insist that you neither interrupt me nor want to trivialize the whole thing, that indisputably you are the man who in every respect has done the main work, all the planning and the financial, etc. And that speaks completely against all the lies and slander of the official fiches. Note insertion, =, explanation. Wikipedia. The so-called Fichtenskandal, also Fichtenafara, is a scandal in recent Swiss history during the final phase of the Cold War. From this, the word Fiechenstaat, fiche state, was formed in Switzerland as a euphemism for a snooping state. Some 900,000 state security fiches were created between 1900 and 1990. They are now in the Federal Archives, whose creators would probably never have been able to achieve what you have achieved in total. And that, I guess, was also impossible for all the envious, renegade early members. Your youngest son and your divorced wife, as well as all the malicious antagonists of all kinds, who in a devious way maliciously and secretly tried to make you impossible all around. This by defaming you with the police, with authorities and also with state security persons, as well as with journalists and many persons all around, and by degrading you by lying and all kinds of maliciously sunned slanderous accusations, by trying to humiliate you and make you impossible.
Are you done with it now, Ptah? For your speech was not necessary. The whole thing is just rehashing old things that are long gone and no longer relevant and really belong to oblivion and therefore should not be brought up again. So I do not want to write them down then when I retrieve the report of the conversation.
I do not agree with this, because you are still being accused of lies and deceit by unthinking, mindless and senseless earth humans all over the world, because they have become believers in the lies and slanders against you that are spread practically in all states of the earth. Therefore, let it be that you call up my speech, write it down, and also spread it worldwide. In doing so, and I have thoroughly considered this, which we have also discussed and decided in the committee, you shall also include the whole of my explanations, which I have learned from my father's Annals and brought to your attention.
Are you really serious?
Your question is futile.
I do not like it, but if that's what you have decided, I guess it has its rationale, but you'll have to explain it to me later.
I will do that, but only privately.
Is also fine with me. Good. Then I'll call up everything that's been said and write it down, although, as usual, I'll have a bit of trouble translating it all into written German. Our Zurich Swiss German, in which we converse, always needs a little extra polish when it comes to language transposition, so that the German into which I have to transpose and write everything corresponds exactly to what we speak in Zurich German. Well, good. We talked before about what you told us from your father's Annals. To this I have to add that I should mention something that I have begun to explain, but have not finished. And this refers to the fact that it never occurred to me, except in the case of the Horatine, from whom I snatched the wet cloth and hit her back in the face with it, to wreak vengeance on her for all her evil, for I have never been vindictive. However, when I played a hard joke on others who teased me or taught them a lesson, I basically thought of it as teaching them a lesson. And when I was on the road all these years in many countries and worked for the police and certain rulers and sometimes had to defend myself against evil elements, I actually understood the whole thing as an act of necessity, from which those affected could also learn a lesson. I have also not done anything else in my life up to now, because I do not carry any hatred against any human being within me, not even when someone has done, is doing, or should continue to do evil to me. On the other hand, in my time, in the 1940s, many human beings in my hometown were also still very strongly dependent on faith, the Bible, God, salvation, and religion, especially those of the sects who were particularly fanatical. At that time, all hell broke loose among the Bible believers and God believers, etc., if they allowed themselves to be stirred up and took up a banner against someone in order to harass and finish him off. In this respect, many people in Buli and also in Niederflachs were no exception. Many were fanatical delusionists who became furious if anyone said anything against religion, faith, God, the mendacity of the Bible, or against their crazy belief in ghosts and witches and their alleged experiences, with all kinds of spirits of deceased people who were supposed to have met them or told them strange things. In particular, the story of the devil was circulated, who was said to have met people returning home late at night at midnight in the form of a black billy goat in the Bachgasse, a short, steep road about 25 meters long leading up to the army stables, and who would then disappear in a flash with a bang and smoke and with devilish bleating when the people called on God and recited the Lord's Prayer. The name Bachgasse was on everyone's lips among the old people of Niederflach, and was probably coined after the devil's story, precisely in reference to the devil, who is said to have appeared to the people at midnight as a black billy goat. Because I once told a neighbor, namely the master painter Baumann, that the story of the devil and the goat was nonsense, he hit me on the head. And now that I'm talking about it, I remember that he was always called Papierli Swiss by the people of Niederflach, and the reason for that was because he had been granted Swiss citizenship as an immigrant German. Today, when I recall memories from my youth, because you made me think of them with Svath's Annals, I think that if the witch hunts had still existed at that time, I would probably have been burnt at the stake by many fanatical believers from Lower Flanders and Boolum. What else needs to be said is that, as a result of my knowledge of religion, I was given the name Pope at school by my fellow pupil Leo Wikihalter. This name is still attached to me by one or two of my former schoolmates. At least it was like that years ago when about 30 alumni visited me one afternoon. But the thing with the school board and municipal authorities happened without my knowledge, because everything was handled in such a way that I received no information at all, but only had more and more trouble. And that also included the thing with the neighbor, the Horatin, and the terror of Teacher Frey, with everything becoming more and more blatant. So the fanatical Bible and God believers in the home authority took action against me, as you explain from Svath's notes, because my belief in God did not suit them. And Ptah, if your father wrote this as you could read it from your father's annals, then it must undoubtedly have been so. So then, according to Svath's annals records, the spiteful neighbor, whom we actually only called Horatin, but whose correct name was Horacek, had been pointed out and paid for by the fanatically religious and, as well as Teacher Frey, as you say. So this was done in order to torment and destroy me, in order to force me into the Christian faith.
Yes, but that was a complete failure. So they all searched for and found a way to get you away from home through infamous official decisions to keep you in an alien environment and to educate you. And thus, as is evident from Father's statements in the Annals of Svath, everything was to lead to forcing the Christian faith upon you. But as he has also recorded in writing, the whole of these facts were completely falsified in official files and accordingly made out and recorded in files by false, mendacious and slanderous records. Consequently, no real facts at all were recorded, but only mendacities throughout, which are still being unlawfully held against you today. This, then, according to the words of my father Svath, is all written in his annals. And this also refers to the false reports of Teacher Hans Frey, who was also paid by to badly bully you, so that you should have been taught better, give up your disbelief in God and turn to the Christian faith in search of help. Edward, my friend, all that I know so far from my father's annals leads me to an interest in the history of your hometown of Bulak, which is why I ask you to tell me something about this place, because knowing you, I am sure you have occupied yourself with the history of the place.
Yes, I have, because at school we also had to learn the history of our hometown, of course, which was extremely interesting. Buli, or Bulak, was already a significant and important place in ancient times, which is probably no longer of interest to the people of Boolum in general, and probably only a few people know about it. At most the archaeologists, etc. But if that's all right with you, then I'm sure you're interested in the history of the village. But if it is good for you, I would know something better than to have to tell you everything myself for hours. because when I was looking for something about Buli on the internet, I found good descriptions of Bulak on Wikipedia, with even more information than I had learned at school. I can look those up if you're interested.
Of course, that's me.
Good. Then I can look for it right away if you want to wait a bit. Aha, I have got it there already. It did not take long. If you want to read it when you have time.
That's what I am interested in, so I want to read it and also copy it.
Okay, you can read it. In the meantime, I can have a...
Then go ahead, because you do not have to be here when I read it.
History of Bulak source Wikipedia. Bulak in the native Zurich German dialect Buli is a political municipality and the capital of the district of the same name in the Swiss canton of Zurich. The town of Bulak is the economic center of the Zürcher Unterland region. Geography. Bulak lies at 428 meters above sea level at the western foot of the Dattenberg. In addition to the actual town settlement with its medieval core, Bulak includes the villages of Eschenmosen, Nussbaumen, and Heimgarten. The present-day district of Niederflachs was originally also a separate settlement. The air distance to Zurich is 16 kilometers. The municipal area, 1609 hectares, consists of 39% forest, 31% is used for agriculture, and 30% is used for settlement and traffic. History early. History in Middle Ages. The area around Bulak was already a settlement zone in prehistoric times. In 1980, burn pits from the late Bronze Age were discovered in Schwarzgrube. The Celtic rampart on the Rheinsberg as a fortification of a smaller Celtic settlement, Oppidillum. Small Oppidum was investigated in 1998-99 by the University of Zurich and the Cantonal Archaeology Department, and dated to the 10th/9th century BC Habe III period by means of C14 investigations. The rampart consisted of stones, a box construction with fill material, a wooden rampart front made of oak beams, and a submitted ditch. Burial mounds of the late Hallstatt period, with burials of weapons, jewelry, and utensils, were found in the Horrigan and Hardwald forests. At the time of the Roman Empire, a Roman estate was located in the present-day town area. The oldest traces of Alemannic village formation date from the 6th and early 7th centuries. Alemannic graves with archaeologically significant finds were excavated near the town center in the Fuchsli in 1919-28. 2 brooches were found. One is the so-called fish brooch pair. The other is the Bulak brooch, the only find with runic inscription in Switzerland to date as of 2013. The archaeological excavations made in 1968 in the local Reformed church brought to light the grave of a noble woman from the 7th century, separate from all the other graves found under the nave, directly under the then location of the church's baptismal font. The woman's costume was that of an Alemanni, in addition to rich jewelry, a cotton dress, shoes embroidered with silk, and a linen cloak. It is worth mentioning that small copper plates with the Christian cross were worked into her necklace, which indicates that the woman was of Christian faith. In the same excavation in 1968, several plague graves were found. The deceased had been cast in lime, which was customary at the time for victims of the plague. Bulak was first mentioned in 811 in a document of the Abbey of St. Gallen as Pulacha. The name goes back to an unattested form pretium, *Pulicum estate of Pullius, a derivative of the Latin personal name Pullius formed with the Celtic suffix acos. The village, which developed into a closed settlement in the High Middle Ages, was already fortified with walls in the 13th century. Bulak was subject to the barons of Tengen until 1376 at the latest since the 13th century. In 1384, when Duke Leopold III of Austria took over the bailiwick, Bulak was granted town rights with its own jurisdiction. Bulak owed this privilege above all to its very favorable traffic situation. In 1386, Bulak burnt down during the Sempach War. In 1409, Bulak was first pledged to Zurich and finally fell to the city in 1419. From 1412, it formed a Zurich bailiwick together with Baden-Bulak, Niederflochs, and Nussbaumen. Bulak had limited political autonomy until the Helvetic Revolution, Schultheißenamt, and Bürgerwehrsammlung. During the Old Zurich War, Bulak was burnt down a second time in 1444. In 1506, another fire destroyed a large part of the country town. The town hall was rebuilt in 1672-73. The present church building dates from 1508-14, and the nave and tower were rebuilt several times in the 17th and 19th centuries. The Reformation came to Bulak in 1523. However, it only gained a correct foothold in 1528 with the appointment of Johannes Haller as the town pastor. Haller had been an important helper and comrade in arms of Ulrich Zwingli at the Grossmünster in Zurich. During this period, the region and Bulak became an important base for Anabaptism, which was violently suppressed by the Reformed Zurich authorities. 18th and 19th centuries. In 1802, at the time of the Helvetic Republic, Bulak temporarily lost its town charter. In 1831, as a result of the new cantonal constitution, the previously existing Oberamt im Brach was transformed into the present district with the name and capital Bulak. The Zürcher Unterland was traditionally an agricultural area. Due to its town charter, Bulak was the marketplace for the agricultural products of the surrounding area. Extensive municipal forests and numerous commercial and craft enterprises contributed to its prosperity. Clothing manufacture was particularly widespread: shoemakers, tailors, hatters. Compared to the rest of the Unterland, industrialization began early in Bulak. The first mechanical spinning mill with 25 employees was established as early as 1819. In 1850, there were about 150 craftsmen and 20 merchants. In the second half of the 19th century, cattle markets were held regularly. Baden-Bulak became an independent municipality in 1849. The Bulak-Oerlikon railway line of the Bulak-Regensburg railway lines was built by the Nordostbahn and put into operation in 1865. The Bulak-Schaffhausen line was opened in 1893. In 1892 or 1893, the Obstbaugenossenschaft Heimgarten was founded. It was the model for the Eden Gemeinnützige Obstbau-Siedlung in Oranienburg near Berlin. 20th and 21st century, the Catholic Church, Dreifaltigkeitskirche, was consecrated in 1902, and the parish was founded in 1943. In 1890-91, the glass factory was built. Until 2001, the glass factory Vetropack Limited, together with the Somprex and Wowell Glassworks, was the largest glass packaging company in Switzerland. In 1917, the Sulzer AG foundry began operations. Other medium-sized industrial companies are active in the motor, steel, and mechanical engineering industries, as well as in the computer sector. In 1990, a good 1% of the workforce was employed in the first sector, 34% in the second sector, and 65% in the third sector. The first water supply to private houses was put into operation in 1884. The first sewerage ordinance came into force in 1910 with compulsory connection from 1934. The sewage treatment plant has been in operation since 1957. The waste incineration plant Kezu, built in 1967, was closed again in 1975 for environmental reasons. The Bulak District Hospital has existed since 1937. The construction of a secondary school was first discussed in the Cantonal Parliament in 1956. The cantonal school, Zürcher Unterland KZU, was finally opened in 1972. The vocational school emerged from the Sunday or trade school in 1860 and moved into its own school building in 1982. In 1919, Eschen-Mosen, previously part of the municipality of Winkel, became part of Bulak. Since 1974, in addition to the 7-member town council, which acts as the executive, the municipality has had a 28-seat parliament, the Grand Municipal Council, as its legislative authority. Emblems. The emblems refers to St. Lawrence, who was martyred on the grill. St. Laurentius was the patron saint of the Laurentius Church, mentioned in the first reference from 811, a predecessor of today's Reformed Church in Bulak. According to legend, he died after distributing all his possessions to the poor. The rust appears in the town seal since 1385, and as a coat of arms for the first time in Edlibach's Chronicle around 1490. After the Reformation, the coat of arms disappeared in favor of a diagonal red and white branched shield. The reintroduction of the old coat of arms was controversial in the 1920s, but was finally decided at the Municipal Assembly on the 3rd of July, 1931.
Emblem. The silver Laurentius rust in red.
Population 19,000 persons live in Bulak as of May 2015. 24.5% of the residents registered in Bulak, that is to say 4,430 persons, do not have a Swiss passport. Among foreigners, persons from Germany have the largest share, 1051, 5.6%, followed by nationals of Italy, 796, 4.4%, Kosovo, 361, 2%, Serbia, 276, 1.5%, and Turkey, 273, 1.5%. Nationality, the 31st of July, 2013, Switzerland, 75.5%, Germany, 5.6% Italy, 4.4% Kosovo, 2.0% Serbia, 1.5% Turkey, 1.5%. Religious affiliation, the 31st of July, 2013. Evangelical Reformed, 32.3%. Roman Catholic, 27.3%. Other or non-denominational, 40.2%. Politics, the town council. The highest municipal administrative authority forms the executive branch of the town of Bulak. The municipal council is the legislative body of the town of Bulak in place of the municipal assembly and within the framework of the municipal code. It consists of 28 seats. In October 2005, the voters of Bulak were the first in Switzerland to be able to decide on a voting proposal by SMS. Around 12% of those who voted took advantage of this option. In the 2015 National Council elections, the voter percentages in Bulak were SVP 35.5%, SP 19.7%, FDP 13.2%, GLP 6.7%, EVP 5.7%, Greens 5.6%, EDU 4.1%, BDP 3.8%, CVP 3.2%. Economy. The small town has suffered massive job losses in recent years. The Vetropack Glassworks and the Sulzer Iron Foundry closed their doors. The branch of the medical technology group Schneider was able to continue operations through a takeover to form Biotronic and was redemionized in the process. The largest employer is Bulak Hospital with over 700 employees as of 2008. Mageba, a manufacturer of bridge bearings, also has its headquarters here. Transport links rail transport, With the Bulak railway station, the municipality is integrated into the Zurich Transport Network ZVV, as are all Zurich municipalities. The municipality was connected to the railway network on the 1st of May, 1865, as the terminus of the Bulak-Regensburg Railway BR to Oerlikon. The railway company was taken over by the Schweizerische Nordostbahn NOB in 1877 and nationalized as the Schweizerische Bundesbahnen SBB in 1902. On the 1st of August, 1876, with the opening of the NOB's Hockerheinbahn Winterthur Koblenz, Bulak became a railway junction with a wedge station. With the opening of the NOB line Bulak, Eglisau-Neuhausen and Rheinfall through the Rafserfeld, and the Gestetter Zipfel with connection to the NOB-Rheinfalls Railway, Winterthur-Endelfingen-Schaffhausen in Neuhausen. The BR line via Bulak gradually replaced the Rheinfalls Railway as the main line between Zurich and Schaffhausen from the 1st of June, 1897. The railway lines have been the property of the SBB since the nationalization of the private railways in 1902. Since the double-track extension in 1980, the SBB timetable has also applied here. And since May 1990, the Zurich S-Bahn has been operating on behalf of the ZVV. Bulak is served every half hour by the S9 Öster-Zurich HB Bulak Rafs, which continues hourly, half-hourly at peak times to Schaffhausen. The SBB subsidiary Thurbo operates the S41 Winterthur Bulak, which runs every half hour on the Winterthur Bulak section on weekdays until around 20 o'clock HRS. Until the 12th of December 2015, Thurbo also operated the S22 to Rafschaffhausen-Singen, which has now been replaced by the S9, but no longer runs to Singen. In addition, there are hourly Interregio Zurich HB Schaffhausen and additional S-Bahn trains at rush hour. Local traffic Bulak station is a regional and local bus hub. The regional ZBV bus lines 515 Bulak Stadel B and 525 Bulak Hori Dielsdorf, operated by Postbus Switzerland Zurich region, Unterland market area, have a basic hourly frequency, and line 530 Bulak Kloten Flughafen Zurich generally runs half-hourly during the day and hourly in the evenings and on Sundays, with a number of roundups. On weekdays during rush hour, a direct branch of line 530 Bulak Flughafen Zurich provides a de facto nonstop connection to the airport. 9 other stops are served by regional bus lines in the municipality. The 3 daily Bulak local bus routes 501, 503, and 504 also fall under the responsibility of Postbus and, in addition to the railway station and 3 regional bus stops, serve a further 21 stops on municipal territory. Line 504 also serves 2 stops in the neighboring municipality of Bakenbulak and runs to Oberglatt ZH with a stop at the end of the runway for aircraft enthusiasts. Individual traffic. The A51 Unterland motorway, Zurich Flughafen Bulak, passes to the west of Bulak and provides access to the municipality via 3 junctions, whereby the motorway ends at the Bulak Nord junction and merges with the main road for Schaffhausen-Bulak-Zurich. The Dielsdorf-Horibalasch-Imbrach road connection is also of cantonal importance, as is the Niederglatt-Hori-Hochfelden-Bulak road at regional level. Churches and ecclesiastical communities. There are the following churches and church communities in Bulak. The Protestant Reformed Church owns the Reformed Church Bulak in the Old Town, whose predecessor buildings from the 7th century onwards have been archaeologically proven. Due to wars and fires, the church was rebuilt several times in the Middle Ages. After the Reformation in 1528, the church was extended to its present size in 1678 and also received the roof truss of Black Forest fir that is exposed today. The church tower as it appears today dates from the 19th century. The 5 colored windows in the choir were designed by the artist Hans Affeltranger in 1970. Also since 1970, the church has had an organ by the organ builder Müllersen from Strasbourg. The Roman Catholic Church in Buleg owns the Dreifaltige Geizkirche. It is located on Spitalstrasse near Bulak railway station and was built in 1901, 1902 according to plans by the architect August Hardiger, 1858-1927. It has remained almost unchanged in its neo-Gothic form throughout the years, and today represents a historical Gesamtkunstwerk of the penultimate turn of the century in rare completeness. In addition to the 2 national churches, the following church communities are represented in Bulak. The Protestant Methodist Church is located on Nordstrasse at the corner of Hochfelderstrasse near Bulak railway station. The New Apostolic Church is located on Nordstrasse directly by Bulak railway station. The church, which was newly built in 2003, received an organ in 2004. The organ was built by the Rieger Organ Building Company and has 22 stops. The Salvation Army is present in the Zurich Unterland on Grampenweg in Bulak. The Free Evangelical Church is located in the north of Bulak on Schützenmattstrasse. The Baptist Church of Bulak is present on Schaffhauserstrasse. The parish hall of the Gemeinde für Christus Evangelischer Bruderverein is also on Schaffhauserstrasse. Places of interest: the fortifications from around 1290 consisted of a wall about 6 meters high and 1 meter thick with a moat in front and 1 town gate each towards Zurich Unter or Zürchertor and Eglisau Obertor. The 5-meter wide moat was filled in 1830. Large parts of the town wall still remain, but have hardly been explored. The late Gothic, later partly Neo-Gothic, remodeled Protestant Reformed church patron St. Laurentius in the town center was built in 1508-1510. It has a 75 m high tower. The Catholic Church of the Trinity was built in 1902 in Neo-Gothic style, according to August Hardiger's plans. See also List of cultural assets in Bulak Wikipedia.
Here I am again, and I see you are at the end of the article on Buli.
Very interesting. That should also be added to your biography because that would correspond to a good description of your native origin.
That would be Bernadette's business. And besides, I will take some unnecessary things out of the description when I put it in the conversation report, because editing notes, etc. contained in it are not necessary. Then we can now also talk about something else, whereby I will probably address various things several times, but now I want to start with the following. The climate destruction taking place on Earth corresponds to a fact that cannot be denied and is also not simply of natural origin. Consequently, it cannot be explained by saying that it is a process that arises completely naturally in the course of time. Of the planet and of the Earth in the course of the changing Earth ages, so now also in the Anthropocene. This does not correspond to the truth, because very precise and centuries-long Plejaren observations, research and clarifications show beyond doubt that the ongoing climate destruction does not correspond to a natural climate change, but to a destructive process artificially caused by earthly mankind. And if this process is not stopped in the course of time, a climate collapse is imminent, to which a large part of humanity will fall victim. The blame for the whole beginning of the climate disaster first arose from the time of the First World War from 1756 to 1763, and then from the resulting industrialization, as well as from the Second World Wars. Then there was the continuous multiplication of mankind in enormous masses and the inevitable overpopulation, and through this, their needs for life and luxury as well as their procurement increased rapidly, and to heights that could only be achieved or produced through destruction, annihilation and extermination in nature, its fauna and flora, and in practically all ecosystems as well as on the planet itself. This has continued until today and will also continue to be the case if the Earthlings do not finally give up their stupidity and self-importance, and find their way to understanding and reason, and thus to the realization that they must stop all destructive and exterminating machinations on the planet and on all ecosystems. But this is only possible through a rapid and comprehensive reduction of humanity, namely through a long-term and effective birth stop and a subsequent strict birth control. The spreading of thousands of poisonous substances into the entire environment must also stop. This is because the vapors of these toxins, since their release into nature and the atmosphere, fuse and react with each other, creating new toxic gases that are extremely dangerous to health and cause organic damage, mainly cancerous tumors in human beings, resulting in much suffering, pain, and death. However, this is also only a part of the whole, because the destruction of the worldwide ecosystems, of nature and the planet as well as the atmosphere, has provoked the destruction of the climate, whereby CO2 and other greenhouse gases, such as nitrous oxide and methane gas, etc., also play a major role in the destruction of the climate. Due to the worldwide and still continuing destruction of the environment in many respects, which is also the result of the irresponsible machinations of overpopulation, including the plasticization of the oceans, lakes, rivers, streams, all landscapes, moors, steppes, and even deserts, forests, rainforests, primeval forests, and the mountains, as well as their construction of all kinds and the overall associated heat generation. In many ways, climate destruction has developed over time. And if this is not counteracted, which is only possible through a reduction of humanity, namely through a long-term birth stop and a subsequent precise birth control, then a climate collapse will be unavoidable. Climate disruption has resulted in the disruption and destruction of the specific abiotic and biotic factors, of the habitats in which the multiform organisms of all genera and species lived at a certain stage of their life cycle. But through the immense overpopulation and its needs, which have been and continue to be fulfilled to satisfy humanity through destructive, exterminatory, and irresponsible machinations, not only was climate change provoked and brought about, but the climate destruction that now prevails. And the fact is that with every new birth of an earthling, the needs for its life and sustenance increase steadily more, whereby all around all destruction, annihilation, and extinction, and thus also climate destruction continues to advance. If the whole of all causes of the disaster of environmental and climate destruction is analyzed precisely, then it is recognized that only the ecological and planetary destructive machinations carried out by overpopulation have led to the climate catastrophe. This is due to the fact that the Earth has been hollowed out, or rather, that enormous depletion of the Earth has taken place, and that this has been and will continue to be done through enormous exploitation of resources, which have been directed towards natural gas, peat, ores of all kinds, rare earths, precious metals, petroleum, and coal. And this for the necessary needs to sustain the life of the horrendously increasing humanity or overpopulation, as well as for their satisfaction and greed with regard to luxury goods in every respect. And within this framework, everything will also continue in the future until a climate collapse becomes unavoidable. If a worldwide birth stop of several years is not enforced in the foreseeable future, and a worldwide birth control is not carried out afterwards, in order to bring Earth humans to a planetary level of a reasonable population number. Well, even if ongoing climate destruction now brings much disaster, suffering, death and destruction, as well as annihilation and extinction upon the world and the entire overpopulation humanity, such as increased volcanic eruptions, natural disasters, earthquakes, seaquakes, primeval storms, enormous and hardly containable forest fires of all kinds, and other fire disasters, life goes on. And it will continue to do so if the already precarious melting of the glaciers and the ice masses of the South and North Poles continues inexorably from now on, changing the Gulf Stream in the Atlantic and the planetary circulation, and thus also the jet streams. The planetary circulation corresponds to the global wind system, which is related to solar irradiation and produces an uneven distribution. The planetary circulation, I was taught by Svath, is the westerly winds of the mid-latitudes or the trade winds of the tropical regions, which form important media or links and commonalities. Through their entire function, effects and impacts, the climate continues to change and warm, which also causes the glaciers and the poles to melt, which also causes the seas to rise and flood and wash away large areas of land. But there is no reason to be hysterical about this, because nature cannot degenerate more than simply to the maximum in terms of climate destruction, precisely until the maximum possible is reached. And this is also the case when climate destruction will inevitably not stop its progress and cannot be halted, until the Earthlings finally come to their senses and reason and drastically reduce their mass, and thus gradually also all their destructive, annihilating and exterminating machinations on the planet, on all global ecosystems as well as the atmosphere and the climate. This, however, can only be the case through a long-term birth stop and a following birth control. There are good articles written, but they usually try to avoid addressing the real problem, namely that the whole disaster is solely due to the machinations of overpopulation. If it were not for the huge mass of Earth humans, then there would be nothing to worry about from all the global climate problems and all the destruction, annihilation and extinction, etc. What the naive little Greta Thunberg caused with her one-person demonstration in Sweden, which was unconscionably controlled from somewhere, and the Fridays for Future movement that arose from it, would also not have to be spoken of and unjustifiably and unreasonably sung her praises. The same must be said about the 25-year-old German climate activist Louisa Marie Neubauer, because she too, like Greta Thunberg, is blowing up the climate problem out of proportion to reality and causes, thus promoting the unjustified climate hysteria that heats up all the crazy climate demonstration freaks and makes them roar around the world in fear and hysteria. If the entire consequences of the climate hysteria are considered, then specific individual factors can be singled out, whereby those irresponsible political parties, explicitly the Greens, and also those rulers who have hijacked the whole of the climate hysteria and continue to do so, in order to use it to grandly elevate themselves, to place themselves in the foreground and to make themselves important, are to be mentioned in particular. And the fact that these irresponsible and unjust government incompetents, excluding, of course, all righteous rulers and party members, come up with confused, nonsensical and largely useless climate protection measures, into which millions of dollars are to be poured, and which are to be taken out of the pockets of the people through crazy new taxes, is probably more than exploitation. And moreover, acting in this way is the best way to increase the price of all the necessary goods needed to sustain life. As a result, all the populations of those states will find it increasingly difficult to make a living through this state exploitation. This is in addition to the fact that many will fall into poverty as a result of this kind of state-ordered financial exploitation. And when it is seen that while the fallible rulers, who with their nonsense bring about the whole of this unpleasant revenue, themselves collect more than just sufficient and excessive remuneration and can live in joy and glory and financial carelessness without having a guilty conscience, then many a suffering earthling's hat justifiably goes up.
These words are also important to be said once and hopefully also to be put out into the world. It is also listed in my father's annals that you both also fathomed the present time and further also the following years and observed the whole of the nonsense of the climate demonstrations. I read that even then, according to my father's notes. It was in the month of November in 1950 you described everything as foreign hysteria and said that a sectarianism and, so to speak, a new religion would emerge from it and spread all over the world.
So Svoth noted that I did not know that. Obviously, he noted often and a lot.
Of course, because just as today we record every single word that you and we speak together, so did my father Svoth, even if you did not know about it.
Oh, I did not know that either, as apparently I did not know a great deal else.
That was and is indeed the case because my father did not want to and was not allowed to burden you with various things, because that would have impaired your learning, which was not allowed to happen. But everything shall now no longer remain a secret to you, which is why I will now gradually make everything known to you according to Father's instructions, as he has laid it down in his secret annals.
I am glad I get to know after all. I am really looking forward to it. Together, we have also talked a lot about what the present and future times will bring with them through the destruction of the climate, which is now only beginning to have its correct effects worldwide, and which has effectively come about through the machinations of insane overpopulation. Although I have never spoken openly about this until now, perhaps we should not remain silent about it after all. Perhaps it would be good to say a word about it. But so far I have been held back by my misgivings that everything will be misunderstood through the craziness of the Earthlings, and accordingly everything will be evaluated in an even more destructive way. This especially by all the crazy people who, as climate freaks, with their climate hysteria and their climate hysteria demonstrations, are slowly driving the entire Earth humans into madness and into a worldwide disharmony and anarchy and exploitation by means of new climate taxes, which are being earthentized by irresponsible rulers of all kinds of states and criminally inflicted on the peoples for the enrichment of the state.
English translation, 727th Contact Part 2. Friday, the 22nd of November 2019, 21:11 hours.
Well, in fact, what I want to say refers to the fact that fundamentally the overflowing mass of Earthlings, respectively the immense mass of overpopulation, is to blame for the climate disruption. And this through all their destructive, annihilating and exterminating machinations and manipulations with regard to all ecosystems, as well as the Earth itself, namely through their exploitation of resources and harassment in every conceivable degenerate way. All this corresponds to a fact that must be absolutely clear to every human being who does not vegetate in stupidity, but uses his intellect and reason. The irresponsible machinations and manipulations carried out by the masses of overpopulation in order to maintain their further growth, to procure food and luxury goods, have without any doubt led to many irreparable destructions, annihilations, and diverse extinctions in all ecosystems, as ultimately also to climate destruction. This will now cause more and more mischief upon mischief worldwide through natural catastrophes on an inexorably increasing scale. Destroy, annihilate, and exterminate an infinite number of human achievements, an immense amount of nature and its fauna and flora, because the course of the whole can no longer be stopped. What has just begun, even if it was created by humanity itself, must take its course, which will last for very, very long centuries and can no longer be stopped. And that is a fact that even all those stupid people who still deny everything have to accept. Namely, that the climate catastrophe is there, is ongoing, and is the fault of the Earthlings, and does not simply correspond to a natural cycle. But stupidity does not die out, which means that the Earth will continue to be teeming with stupid people whose intellect is not sufficient to use their intellect and reason to perceive, recognize and understand the effective reality and truth. What remains to be explained is the fact that the whole climate hysteria hype is completely moronic, which has been irresponsibly conjured up by using the small, uneducated and naive Greta Thunberg, who is unconscionable and greedy for profit. And that is an effective fact, because she has no idea whatsoever about the entire climate process and its interrelationships, origins and functions, etc., and has also become megalomaniac and under the delusion that she is doing something good and that her childish actions can shake up and save the world. And this is also the case with regard to the entire overgrowth of all the yelling, screaming, and increasingly rowdy climate demonstrators. However, the whole thing is absolutely stupid, nonsensical, morbidly stupid, and only caused and thereby conditioned so that unscrupulous profit sharks can financially and profit greedily nudge themselves into health through all kinds of criminal machinations. This, while also many irresponsible rulers and political parties, especially the green-haired variety, and the other political elements who go along with them, who loudly howl for climate protection, make themselves important and hypocritically howl that they could change everything for the better if they did this, that and the other, for which they demand horrendous sums of money in taxes from the people. However, they do not admit to the peoples or to themselves that they are lying through their teeth and deceiving the peoples in the hope that this will get them more attention and higher government, because they themselves are lying abysmally and making fools of themselves in sheer stupidity. All the loudmouths, Know-it-alls and big promisers who have jumped on the climate-disturbing horse that they hope will lead to political, governmental, financial and other greed for profit, politics and power, and who are now riding it, or trying to ride it, are just as much spreading lies and committing fraud as all. The hysterical climate demonstrators who are stupid and dumb and have no idea about climatology. With all their nonsensical fantasies, stupid ideas and demands to curb climate destruction, nothing can be changed for the better, and the course of the whole disaster that has broken loose cannot be stopped, let alone ended. The climate destruction caused by human guilt, even if this is denied by crazy and stupid know-it-alls, is going on now and will bring disaster to the whole planet and mankind for a very long time, until the climate settles down and stabilizes in its own way in a new climate form. All the pathological and stupid pseudo-measures of the counselors, loudmouths, rulers, demonstrators, and yelling and screaming about are of no use, because the process of climate destruction is also impossible to stop quickly. And that is an irrefutable fact, because the whole transformation of a natural process takes a very long time, centuries and possibly millennia, and there is nothing human beings can do about it. So any hysteria is nothing but absolute nonsense and complete stupidity and idiocy. The fact is that the various bogus measures demanded by clueless climate protection freaks, politicians and rulers, mainly the Greens and the highest autocrats in the state leaderships, such as CO2 reduction, radical CO2 bans and the nonsensical financial demands, tax levies, new regulations and bans, etc., will never bring about what is claimed, and the peoples are illusorily led to believe that everything will improve as a result. The effective fact is that all this nonsense only benefits those hypocrites who, through their unfair and exploitative machinations, exploit every affected population financially and enslave them with fines-paying bans, without even the slightest change in the climate disaster or an improvement being achieved. The fact that the climate can change back into a better form, which will take a very, very long time, probably centuries, requires the use of reason and rationality of Earthlings worldwide. Such a change for the better can only take place if all horrendous, criminal, destructive, annihilating and exterminating machinations and manipulations that have led to climate destruction are radically and quickly brought to an end. And to this climate change, as it is obviously misleadingly quite deliberately trivialized by climatologists, led the catastrophically overflowing mass overpopulation humanity, which since the year 1800 in only about 2 centuries from then an Earth population of 892 million, 333,410 human beings like degenerated wild sex-addicted rabbits by more than 10 times to today, 8,953,851,416 Earthlings and the world swamping. And in the next coming year 2020, the 9 billion mark will be massively exceeded. Whereby, contrary to the moronic claims of those fools who live in delusion and prophesy that only in 2050 Earth humans will have 10 billion, this number will already be reached by 2030 at the latest. And if this actually happens, then the final program of the destruction, annihilation, and extinction process will run inexorably. And under certain circumstances, the red meteor can also contribute to this, as can a factor that is taking place far behind the planet Pluto at the present time in a ring region, discovered by earthly astronomers as early as 1930, and interspersed with many space bodies as an event that can, under certain circumstances, bring unpleasant things for the whole solar system and thus also for Earth. Today I know that this ring region, as it was called at that time by Sfath, was later given the name Kuiper Belt. Well, at that time, in 1950 I remember, Sfath flew with me far out into the interstellar space of our Dern universe, where we observed a large dark spherical structure, a dark moon or small planet or something, he said, which, according to his calculations and explanations, was heading for our solar system, but which then penetrated the protective shield of the thin heliosphere bubble, thus entering our solar system and then the large ring region. There, he found, the structure collided with large and small space bodies, attracted various of them to itself and sucked them up, thereby changing its previous orbit into a ring orbit and henceforth remained in the system. However, The whole thing would lead to consequences in the way that the old order of the ring region would be strongly disturbed, and entities would also be catapulted out of it, which would move through the solar system space as dark or bright wanderers, and could also become dangerous for Earth under certain circumstances. Such wanderers, by which he meant asteroids and comets, were also on the move elsewhere in the entire solar system, which could also be dangerous to Earth, whereby some special ones were among them. For example, some individual large ones with a diameter of up to 500 meters, as well as small asteroid systems, as he called them, which we call swarms, however, and which contain a larger number of objects. Asteroids are also called small planets or planetoids, as well as astronomical small bodies that move through the solar system, far out to the Kuiper belt behind Pluto, etc., but also in orbits around the Sun. Asteroids are much larger than meteorites, which range in size from a millimeter to a meter, and are therefore also much smaller than dwarf planets, which reach kilometer sizes. Such planets are expected to come close to Earth in 70 years, which corresponds to the present time, and several larger ones several hundred meters in diameter, as well as an asteroid system or a larger swarm. There was much more to what Svath said and clarified, but I really do not remember it all. Svath talked a lot about the SOL planets and also took me to them, and I could also see their moons and many other satellites, especially Jupiter and Saturn. Svath explained, however, that I should call such planetary satellites moons only up to a certain size, but that all other objects that fall below this certain size should be understood as lunaroid. If I remember correctly, he explained that this term was taken from the Latin base word luna, or moon, and meant that a form addressed by it, namely the planetary satellites, which are smaller than a moon in size, have a similarity of properties to the base word, so that the term lunaroid only describes a similarity to a moon, but not a moon. He explained, for example, that only the 29 satellites of Saturn could be described as moons, while all the many other smaller planetary satellites were lunaroids in their entirety. This is also the case with Jupiter, which, like Saturn, is orbited by a certain number of moons and many dozens of lunaroids. I seem to remember that Svath made the remark that earthly astronomers were somewhat limited, and neither judged things correctly nor used correct terms. This was also the case with earthly zoologists, who were far from understanding that the entire natural world of living beings could not simply be called the animal world, because the term animal referred only to mammals. Other living beings of other genera and species, however, would correspond to completely different taxonomies or orders in every respect, and consequently all living beings could not be called animals. He specified the world of living beings into various organized units, such as birds, poultry, lizards, reptiles, beetles, worms, fish, bees, hornets, creepers, spiders, butterflies, etc. Actually, he named those living beings that have a metabolism and are capable of reproduction, growth and evolution, but also react to influences or stimuli from the environment, as well as to internal and external stimuli of the body, to which the life forms react with certain reactions. And if I were to summarize his main list, he would name the particularly organized units as follows.
Animal world. Mammals are vertebrates, throw or give birth to living offspring, which are suckled by the mother for food, such as elephants, monkeys, hoofed animals, carnivores, marsupials, hares, rodents, bats, or fluttering animals such as bats, which occur in specific areas of the world adapted to them. For example, the smooth-nosed free-tailed bats, bulldog bats, smooth-nosed bats, flying foxes, leaf-nosed bats, as well as some species of horseshoe bats, and the mouse-eared bats, which are found almost all over the world. Animals usually have hair, with a few exceptions. Actually, only the rodent naked mole rat, which belongs to the suborder porcupine relatives, is a sand digger and is native to burrows in the semi-deserts of East Africa, especially in the south of Ethiopia, but also in Kenya and Somalia, and usually has 4 legs for locomotion. Only a few mammals have two legs and are so-called bipeds, for example certain species of monkeys and kangaroos. Birds and poultry equal signland and waterfowl. These are vertebrates that have a beak and plumage. Lay eggs, incubate them in order to produce offspring, which already, after hatching, take up food absolutely independently by pecking, snacking, and feed themselves. Large birds and certain poultry, such as today's chickens, began to evolve into new life forms in the first genera and species as a result of a world climate catastrophe. 2 million years ago, an atmospheric fire or a tremendous atmospheric explosion occurred, as could be determined by time travel. It turned out that a porous giant meteor penetrated the Earth's shell and exploded high in the atmosphere. On the one hand, an enormous heat was generated, and much of the Earth's surface was burnt away, while on the other hand, an enormous mass of asteroid dust changed the climate worldwide and affected much life of all kinds, after which the climate changed several more times during 30.4 million years. Then, 46.8 million years ago, the entire world of life forms began to change again in the course of time, as had also been the case during the preceding period as a result of climate changes. Many early and very large life forms fell victim to this change, as some time travels back to that time and corresponding observations have shown. The great dinosaurs, for example, died out over a period of several million years. Although some species continued to exist for a very long time, even in all areas of today's northern and southern Europe, down to Arabia and Africa, as well as from North to South America. Their various descendants gradually adapted to the new climatic conditions, changed, became smaller over millions of years, as did the entire vegetation, and adapted to the new climatic and ecological conditions, just like the new life forms that emerged from the changes. According to Svarth, today's chickens, for example, evolved from earlier walking dinosaurs and from pterosaurs as descendants of the reptile Tyrannosaurus rex. However, according to Svarth's explanations, the whole of this world-encompassing process had nothing to do with the asteroid crash about 66.4 million years ago, near what is now Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula in Central America, a small part of which was swept away. As far as I know, this is not known to geologists, who assume that the meteor only crashed into the sea. The crashed giant asteroid probably caused a giant crater of almost 200 kilometers in diameter. This is now called Chicxulub crater, but the catastrophic destruction directly resulting from the crash did not extend over the entire Earth, as false earthly geological and paleontological claims, etc., have shown for a long time. In truth, the direct area of destruction was just a little over 1,800 kilometers wide, and it was in this direct area that all life was completely wiped out and extinct, so also all the various dinosaurs living there, which, by the way, had habitats deep down into South America, as well as in the present areas of Africa, Arabia, and the ancient northern regions of the Earth, as Svarth explained. The geological, paleontological, and biological fantasies that the crash caused a worldwide extinction of all large and biggest creatures, such as dinosaurs, etc., is absolute nonsense, because effectively only the direct area of influence of 1,800 kilometers was affected in this way. While outside this area, the giant meteor impact caused very severe damage, destruction, annihilation, and the death of living beings. but the severity of the impact steadily decreased depending on the distance from the source of the impact. As a result, only a gigantic tsunami swept across the Atlantic because a large part of the comet had not fallen onto land but into the sea. But the areas to the east, what exists today as Europe and Eurasia, were only affected by weak impacts, and so there was little to no destruction, annihilation and extinction of life forms anymore, just as there was no impact across the Pacific to Asia and the rest of Earth. The gigantic asteroid impact near Yucatan 66.4 million years ago only had a horrendously catastrophic effect on the ecosystems in Central America, while North America and South America as a whole were more or less affected, because the further away from the site of the crash, the more the whole thing weakened. And the huge amounts of dust that were supposedly thrown into the Earth's atmosphere by the crash. As our clever researchers claim, Svarth said that only a little dust was created from the small piece of land that was affected by the meteor's crash, because most of it fell into the sea. So also the sun did not darken for a long time, just as the temperatures did not drop rapidly and for a long time. What did happen, however, as Svarth explained, were enormous masses of water that raced hundreds of kilometers inland as tsunamis, spreading out and flooding everything, as well as enormous masses of water being hurled high into the atmosphere and causing disastrous precipitation. A worldwide dramatic decline in species, as is claimed, also does not correspond to the truth, but only to fantasy hypotheses, because such an event only occurred on the entire North and South American continent affected by the meteor impact, because the impact had very little or no influence at all on all other areas of the Earth, neither on the ecosystems nor on the geological structures, so consequently no geological changes occurred. Since only North and South America were affected by the meteor impact, the rest of the Earth was not affected. So neither animals nor plants were directly affected, so they did not have to recover from the effects of the meteor crash disaster, but were able to develop normally. I have already mentioned that the development of the really great diversity of species on Earth began significantly 77.2 million years ago, when an atmospheric fire caused a climate change that lasted 30.4 million years. During this time, all life continued unstoppably. Consequently, all life forms of all genera and species also developed in a completely natural way. Then, as I said, 46.8 million years ago, through another natural event, the actual very great process of transformation began with regard to all existing life forms of all kinds. From this also, the first being emerged from many transformations, which for the first time had developed 5 toes on each foot and 5 fingers on each hand, which also walked alternately on all 4 limbs or only on the 2 hind legs, and from which then 12 million years ago the human being emerged. In the Messel pit in Germany, these creatures were shown to me by Svarth as a fossil, for which I found a photo on Wikipedia, which I will copy and paste in my current speaking place. I am of course absolutely aware that the entire earthly paleontological science will deny everything that the human beings of the Earth ultimately developed from this being. Consequently, it is also claimed that another living being developed from it. But I do not care, because I rely on what Svarth explained when he took me to the Messel pit, showed me the fossil and explained that he had personally checked everything to the last detail, and therefore knew without a doubt that the human beings of Earth had emerged from these beings. Wikipedia also contains the story about the Messel pit, which I will also take the liberty of copying and attaching as an appendix at the end of our conversation for anyone who is interested. Amphibians equal sign frogs, creeping amphibians, and tailed amphibians. These are toads, frogs, newts, toads, and salamanders that live both on land and in water. Most are nocturnal and thus protect themselves from predators. Amphibians reproduce individually generally by laying eggs in the water in the form of spawn, which then hatch into gill-breathing larvae that feed themselves. These larvae normally metamorphose into a lung-breathing adult individual, which can then also live outside of water. The physiology, or rather the processes and functions of the entire organism of all amphibian species, is geared towards keeping water loss on the skin low, and is therefore bound to habitats with high humidity. Reptiles are warm-changing vertebrates that move about by crawling or running. The dinosaurs, which died out about 65 million years ago, also belonged to the class of reptiles. According to Svarth's explanations, contrary to the claims of earthly paleontologists or dinosaur researchers, the very first reptiles did not colonize the Earth 315 million years ago, but already 467 million years ago in their first forms, as unique fossilized finds by him prove. All the reptiles have 4 legs, as was also the case with the reptile Tyrannosaurus rex, which, however, walked on only 2 hind legs because the 2 front legs were atrophied, small, short, and unfit for walking. Various reptiles lay calcareous, shell-encased, waterproof eggs, while others cast or expel their offspring alive, which immediately feed themselves, such as sea snakes, etc. According to Svarth, reptiles evolved partly from early amphibians, but others from various early pterosaurs. So also in this respect, the assumptions of earthly paleontologists do not agree with Svarth's statements. And this is also the case with regard to the paleontological data. Insects, Kerfer, are arthropods and mostly winged small creatures. Their bodies are usually clearly divided into head, thorax, and abdomen, which in their adult form have an outer shell of chitin and 6 legs, and are thus hexapods or hexapods, which usually have 2 pairs of wings. Insects, or kerf, are the most species-rich class of arthropods, as they are also the absolutely most species-rich majority and class of all living beings. According to Svarth, they comprise several million different genera and species on Earth. As already explained, insects are not animals because animals are solely mammalian creatures. If all genera and species of insects and everything self-moving in relation to other small and minute living beings are considered as a whole, then, according to Svarth, more than 75% of all the aforementioned and as yet unnamed life forms are there many millions of genera and species, millions of which are still undiscovered. Fossils of insects and other creatures can be found that lived more than 400 million years ago in the Earth's Devonian age. The females of some insect species can only mate on a single day in their lives, but then they do so with as many males as possible, hoarding their sperm in a so-called spermatheca, which they then use to fertilize their eggs for the rest of their lives. This strategy, however, leads to an evolutionary conflict between the males because they fight for it in a warlike manner in order to enforce their own sperm. For the females, however, it is advantageous if as many of their eggs as possible are fertilized by many males, because only in this way will their genetic material be passed on to many offspring. Unnamed life forms that do not correspond to the aforementioned animals, vertebrates, birds, reptiles, poultry, amphibians or insects, but are each genera and species in their own right, such as the following: praying mantis, spiders, beetles, dragonflies, butterflies, bees, wasps, hornets, grasshoppers, worms, snails, scorpions, crickets, as well as wood wasps, etc., etc. As with insects, these creatures also reproduce by laying eggs, which are often stuck somewhere or deposited in the ground. And as with insects, the eggs of the females are fertilized by mating for the offspring, whereby, as with insects, there can also be competitive fights, as for example with ants and bees.
But now I have digressed again. What I wanted to say was that through the destructive machinations and manipulations inside and outside the planet, precisely on the surface of the Earth, in planet-wide nature, in all its ecosystems, a large part of the whole has been destroyed, annihilated, and wiped out, and devastating things have been carried out and caused. And everything served solely to fulfill the nonsensically demanded needs of the steadily and inexorably increasing overpopulation masses, which have overflowed the whole world tremendously and blatantly. On the one hand, this is to sustain their lives and to satisfy them in an exuberant way for specialities, cravings and addictions, etc. On the other hand, to satisfy them for luxury, vices, sport, etc. For this purpose, Earth resources were exploited, whereby the Earth resources thus obtained were primarily used for the production of deadly weapons, as has always been the case since time immemorial. Is also the case today and will be the case tomorrow, because when new materials are found or new inventions are made, these are first and foremost conceived as tools of murder and weapons of war. So, weapons always come into the concept first before the benefit to the welfare, safety, life preservation and health of humanity, which are first created and used for executions and other murders, as well as especially for military purposes and thus for murderous and zetereric wars and crimes of terrorism. Thus the Earth has been harassed by the overexploitation of ores, as practically most of the planet has been harassed in its interior by the criminal overexploitation of all other resources, such as petroleum, gas, coal, and rare earths. This, while also destroying everything on the surface of the Earth, nature as a whole, its fauna and flora and thus all ecosystems worldwide, whereby everything has been destroyed mainly through poisoning, overfertilization, building, nuclear radiation, and other destructive, annihilating, and exterminating machinations of overpopulation. It is also a result of this in the world of all natural living beings of all ecosystems that many genera and species have to leave their ancestral habitats in order to recolonize in other and foreign areas. And this process has been going on for a long time, both with regard to immobile plants that reach new areas through air currents, animals, birds, etc., or human beings, and also with regard to self-propelling terrestrial and aquatic organisms that look for new living areas themselves, acclimatize themselves in areas foreign to them, and thus acquire new living areas. And in truth, everything that is connected with this and has played and continues to play a decisive role in the development of climate destruction is so varied that I would have to write a tome about it if I wanted to explain and describe everything in detail. However, neither the stupid, howling climate demonstrators nor the so-called experts who call themselves climatologists have the slightest idea of the whole of what I have said so far, because neither the hysterical howlers nor the pundits are concerned with the fundamental causes that have contributed to the climate catastrophe through industrialization, progress in the modernization of technology, lifestyles, ways of working, and many other media. And these factors are 1,000-fold and start with the smallest things, such as the invention of the match, the petroleum lantern, blacksmithing, the burning and grinding of the toe organs of cloven-hoofed animals or horses, mules, donkeys and cattle, the fire-cooking cooker, and the thousands of other things up to the wars, nuclear power plants, forest fires, annual fireworks, methane gases from cattle fattening and CO2 emissions and etc. And all this has increased more and more due to the endless overpopulation growth. Just as in relation to the horrendous growth of overpopulation, also all murder and Gewalt, all manslaughter, crimes, criminality, xenophobia and religious hatred, hatred of nations and hatred among family members and hatred of neighbors, etc. However, many other dangerous and deadly factors have steadily spread everywhere due to the growing overpopulation and are wreaking havoc all over the world, which can only be stopped, contained and minimized, as well as a further worsening of climate destruction and a prevention of climate collapse. If all these causes of all degenerated destruction, annihilation, and extinction are very quickly reduced and ultimately ended. This can only happen if the overpopulation of humanity is drastically reduced by a worldwide responsible long-term birth stop and a following permanent birth control. Only in this way can all further destructions, annihilations, and extinctions on the planet, in the whole of nature and its ecosystems, also be slowly reduced and ultimately brought to an end. And in order to bring about such a reduction of overpopulation to a healthy, normal and planetary population on Earth, which according to Plejaren calculations is 529 million, but at the very most 2 billion, only a birth stop and subsequent birth control can be the only and correct solution. The fact is that every single newly born human being has needs of some kind that can effectively only be met by degenerate destruction, annihilation and extinction of nature and its ecosystems, whereas, on the contrary, every human being who is not born again has no needs of any kind, so that no degenerate destruction, annihilation, and extinction of ecosystems takes place, and no resources have to be taken from the planet. However, the fact that I have now deviated again from what I actually wanted to say was precisely because these facts also have to be mentioned again. However, as far as what is to be said about the climate catastrophe is concerned, it is a question of unscrupulous and stupid earthlings using the fact, which unfortunately has to be feared, to continue to cause damage with regard to the destruction of the climate. This is precisely when I now say what Schwath and I already discussed together more than 70 years ago, because he is on the trail of another influence with regard to climate destruction. This influence, however, is in no way to be seen or evaluated as the trigger of the climate catastrophe, but the effect is solely that of the whole thing being an unstoppable process and intensifying. If I remember correctly, Schwath's explanations about the whole thing being an unstoppable and amplifying process, then there is already a huge change going on in the whole SOL system, which is coming from outside, from the edge of our solar system, but also from beyond our sun. On the one hand, the heliosphere or the astrosphere of the sun, which reaches far through the entire solar system, protects the entire SOL planetary system from a radiation attack from interstellar space. The heliosphere created by the sun, which is a spherical band or bubble at the outermost edge of the system, extends far beyond the outermost planetary orbits, and on the one hand transports interplanetary matter that has penetrated the solar system back into free space, and on the other hand it simply repels media approaching from free interstellar space. But it also results that media that come from the interior of the solar system, and should actually go out into the free space of our Dern universe, are pushed away at the outermost system edge and directed onto a new path, or possibly pushed back into the inner system space again. So the fact is that any media from the inner solar system cannot necessarily penetrate the outermost heliosphere rim, but this does not mean that the outermost thin heliosphere bubble, which forms the end of the solar system, could not be overcome or broken through, because this is quite possible. Consequently, solid matter, etc., can get out into the free space of our Dern universe. However, the whole thing is dependent on the magnetic fields, which have been in a state of flux for about 780 years, and depending on this, cause changes and more transformations. And these forces have been increasing for decades, for about 70 years now, producing strong effects deep into the interior of the solar system, which reach and influence the sun. In addition, these radiations, swinging waves and forces penetrating from the outermost edge of the heliosphere into the inner solar system, are producing great effects through their enormous energies, and this is also affecting the Earth in the climate destruction, as well as a certain area seen from the Earth beyond the Sun, in which new effects are being produced, which are also reaching back to the Earth and having an intensifying effect on the man-made climate destruction. Through the heliosphere, therefore, our Earth is also shielded from all dangerous radiation to which our entire solar system is continuously exposed from interstellar space or from the space of our Dern universe. The heliosphere corresponds, which is clearly stated, to a solar system-wide protective screen, which also protects us on Earth from the high-energy cosmic radiation from the interstellar or infinitely wide space of the matter belt of our Dern universe. This protective shield, the heliosphere or astrosphere of the Sun, extends, as I said, far beyond the outermost edge of the solar system. This radiation-swinging protective screen or heliosphere, which means sun sphere in Greek, fends off media that come from the interstellar or free and open space of the Dern universe. These dangerous media consist of cosmic rays, as a result of which, due to the heliosphere protective screen in the outermost area of the solar system, they cannot reach the interior of the solar system, or only to a small extent, and can cause little or no damage. Thus, at the outermost region and edge of our solar system, the heliosphere or the particle stream emanating from the Sun all around pushes away and displaces as far as possible everything that comes as a medium from interstellar space and collides with the protective screen. And everything that rushes in is absolutely not harmless, because if these media were to penetrate the solar system, which also happens again and again on a smaller scale, then it could suffer very great damage and disaster, as well as fatally endanger everything and all life of every kind and species. Enormous instabilities would arise and cause health hazards on all planets and moons for all existing living beings, which would end fatally. As I know, because I have seen everything myself on the spot together with Svath and with the help of his apparatus, screens and devices, etc., things are happening out there of which our scientists have no idea. I was also able to observe on a screen how things were happening at the edge of the heliosphere that I did not understand. But then Svath explained that there, precisely at the outermost edge of our solar system, interstellar radiation and also neutral atomic accumulations are accumulating and somehow condensing at the thin, wobbling bubble, which then, however, clear up and dissolve again within a few months. From the solar system side or from outside space, this heliosphere zone protective screen is not visible to the naked eye, but only visible on a screen. The whole process, Svath said, if I remember correctly and put everything together as he explained, took place at that time as an already advanced beginning of a transformation of the magnetic fields, whereby the whole thing was restructuring itself into a new form, the effects of which would also cause great changes within the solar system over time and would also affect the Earth. He spoke explicitly of the present time and the time still to come, which we observed together several times, through time jumps, but also of the fact that the effects of the changes in the very thin and unstable peripheral area or the outermost area of the heliosphere bubble would also have consequences for the climate destruction on Earth and affect it. He spoke of a transformation or something like that taking place in the heliosphere zone, or that the whole thing was in an ongoing phase of an overturning movement that would have an accelerating and unpredictable effect as early as 70 years from now, by which he meant today, with regard to the climate destruction brought about by the machinations of overpopulation. Svath explained quite clearly and repeatedly that the entire particle stream of the Sun, the heliosphere, which is also called solar wind, is actually quite unstable at the outermost edge of the SOL system, which is why there can also be no absolute security for the inner solar system. In his pair spaceship, I could observe the outermost radiation of the heliosphere on a screen set up for this purpose as a wobbling, non-uniform radiation swinging waves bubble, which condensed to form a collection of certain media, which was very interesting to observe. About 70 years ago, when Svath and I were there, he explained that a process of change had already begun in the heliosphere, which would have its effects as far as the Sun, as well as seen from Earth far beyond it, where, through the special, further effects would arise because no, stupid. I would better keep quiet also about that, and will not go into it further, and will also leave it out when transcribing our conversation. But I can say that the bubble in the outermost Sol system area, which I would like to call a spherical structure, effectively encompasses the entire SOL system and has a certain effect in the way that influences arise on Earth with regard to climate destruction, which on the one hand accelerate the process, but on the other hand also make it more unpredictable. This in addition to the fact that beyond the sun, as I have just said, seen from Earth, again, stupid. Somehow my talking runs faster than my caution. Good. I just do not talk about it openly, because Foth already said that I'd better never mention the influences acting on climate destruction from there and the effects on Earth. Just as I would better not mention the full facts of the whole thing. I am now abiding by this, even if my flow of words is faster than the idea of silence. I understand that this naturally leaves questions open for those human beings who would like answers, but I cannot change that. I also do not want to and must not give an explanation if I should be asked about the effects of the rapid changes in the interaction of the solar wind with the interstellar gases, swinging waves and radiation around the outermost and thin heliosphere sphere system or the outermost heliosphere bubble. A far too early knowledge of the basic facts in this respect could and would certainly lead, through the irresponsibility of the Earthlings, to developments that would be catastrophic. And that this would be, time has proved since time immemorial, for many good inventions, which were invented and intended for the good and progress of peace, freedom, harmony, justice, and righteousness of the Earth humans, and could have been a true blessing for all Earth humans, have been misused for murderous military purposes and converted into deadly and murderous weapons, and worldwide disaster has been wrought with them. And if the Earthlings were to become aware of the whole thing at the edge of the solar system in its effective extent, then they would gain knowledge from it by which they could produce inventions which would work with even more tremendous destructive power than this has happened criminally through nuclear fission and, moreover, has become even worse. And it should also be said openly that, as Schwath knew and explained to me, the USA had the intention to let Germany perish in an atomic fire with the atomic bombs and bury it in dust and ashes, namely by destroying Berlin and Munich. And that it was also planned to raze other German cities to the ground with further atomic bombs is also concealed to this day. But the fact that the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were destroyed with atomic bombs and hundreds of thousands of human beings were murdered was only due to the fact that Germany surrendered earlier than the USA had expected, and the war in Europe was over before the atomic bombs could be used. So the old plan was carried out, which had already existed years before, that Japan was bombed, namely 2 cities that were actually completely unimportant for the war, but could serve as a bad example. If I now return to the matter of climate destruction, it is because I keep digressing from it, but I have a few more things to say about it, namely that there are 2 factors in all of this that are fundamentally ignored by the Earthlings. On the one hand, it is their religious delusion, which plays a tremendously important role in all of this, as it does in every war, terrorism, political extremism, and fanaticism. On the other hand, there is an underground force at work, which firstly tries to erase all memories of the past, shields off forbidden zones, stirs up aggression and Gewalten in the unstable Earthlings, which the majority of humanity cannot control, because in this respect it is more than just stupid, because it uses neither reason nor rationality in this respect. Because of this, precisely because reason and rationality have never been used and I also make no effort to do so, it happens that a loss of control is caused in the prefrontal cortex, as Schwath explained to me. The cortex prefrontalis is a part of the frontal lobe of the cerebral cortex called cortex cerebri, if I am still getting the term together correctly. This part of the brain is located at the frontal side of the brain and is closely connected to the sensory association areas of the cortex, to subcortical modules of the limbic system and to the basal ganglia, as I read in Wikipedia, which is why the pathologically stupid of the Earthlings are driven to destroy precious ancient human achievements, like the consciousness blinded of the religious terrorist IS, that is to say Islamist State, and other lunatics, who every now and then desecrate or completely destroy valuable old paintings, etc. in museums or elsewhere. But if I now begin again from the beginning and once more address the alien force that drives all unstable Earth humans to Gewalt activity, murder, manslaughter, war, terror, and to all depravity and Ausartung, two against which the stupid ones of the Earth humankind do not defend themselves, because they have made themselves incapable and cowardly of using their own intellect and reason, then this effectively concerns the majority of Earth humans. This is in thrall to all those loud-mouthed populist government hacks, and has neither an opinion of its own, nor can it form or represent one in person. This is in thrall to all those loud-mouthed populist government hacks, and has neither an opinion of its own, nor can it form or represent one in person. It is true that this majority claims that it thinks for itself, has its own opinion, and is not in bondage to other human beings, and above all not in bondage to rulers and populists. But this is no more than an untrue assertion, and no more than something like smoke and mirrors, and precisely a lie with which not only the human beings are lied to, but everyone lies abysmally to himself. And as far as this force influencing the Earthlings is concerned, I will not dwell on it. For on the one hand it would go too far, and on the other hand it would neither be understood nor comprehended nor accepted by all those who are addicted to stupidity. They would rather allow themselves to be influenced by their religious delusion and by this force acting on them, and to continue in their wrong way of life, and to do everything that is wrong for life and destructive to the environment and the climate. And the religious belief in God always plays a part in this and fulfills a very special role, because it forces the believers to do exactly what is demanded by the force influencing them, which drives all believers to violence. In this way, the believers in God, precisely the religious, sectarian believers, deceive themselves, pretend to themselves with regard to their character, their tolerance and humanity, as well as their general humanity and behavior, which in reality does not correspond to their character habitus. This is precisely because they are pretending, deceiving themselves, and in reality there is not one iota of all that they imagine they are, of what their behavior is, and of what their whole innermost character value and their true world of consciousness is directed towards. And that this is undoubtedly the case is constantly proven by the fact that believers in God, the Bible, salvation or religion, as well as philosophers, world ideologists, and atheists, etc., freak out when something goes against their views, opinions, jealousy, lies, defamation, desires, or actions. If the religious faith of the majority of Earthlings is closely examined, then it is effectively to be perceived and recognized that even a tiny iota of dropping the mask of faith is sufficient to let the willingness to use violence, which lies dormant and uncontrolled deep in the character, in some way maliciously break through to the outside. Very often, for the majority of humanity, the dishonestly worn mask of their faith collapses in a flash, with a slight delay in the case of a minority. If even the slightest thing comes up that makes them feel attacked and morally, etc., injured. In this way, all their imaginary good intentions, their false peacefulness, their false love of their neighbor and of humanity, their false tolerance and all their false posturing and pretense, together with their hypocritical and lying righteousness, inevitably, uncontrollably, and very quickly fall away in a flash, and allow all their profound evil character traits to break through uncontrollably to the outside world. In doing so, they do not shy away from malice, slander, blasphemy, lies, and deceit, but above all even from malicious Gewalt, of all kinds, up to and including murder and manslaughter, torture, execution, rape, war, and terror, and this as soon as even the slightest thing arises that does not suit the human beings concerned, be it an inappropriate word, a careless touch, or whatever. The absolute majority of earthly humanity persists in the inconceivable stupidity of its religious doctrinaire delusion, with regard to every conceivable aspect of wickedness, character degeneracy, baseness, brutality, meanness, and hypocrisy, and so on. And all these human degenerations are especially expressed when it is a question of pestering, harassing, tormenting, insulting, and damaging, slandering, torturing, and depriving of life fellow human beings as a result of something. And all this happens for an infinite number of stupid, primitive, and incomprehensible reasons, be it because a human being tells the truth, has made a mistake, is of a different opinion, or be it because of his appearance, his possessions or other beliefs, an act or deed he has committed, or be it because he is honest and blameless, etc. for the human being, it is unhesitating to always and immediately, out of any flimsy idiotic thoughts and feelings, insult, condemn, deny, cheat, mob, slander, and even torture, kill or involve in wars, terror, and destruction, a fellow human being, a group of human beings or entire peoples. And all this happens unthinkingly out of basenesses that are deeply hidden in the character of human beings and break through and cause mischief at every possible and impossible opportunity. And these lacks of character are founded in unscrupulousness and any lack of compassion and sense of responsibility towards fellow human beings, life, the environment, nature, and all living creatures of fauna and flora. The human being of this characterless kind lives in a morally unethical or immorally badly motivated thought-feeling psychic world, which in every respect is only oriented towards his own benefit and advantages, whereby he also reveals his character degeneration through a levelless and often vulgar language, as well as through primitive gestures, actions, deeds, and other incorrect and inhumane behavior, which, however, he does not perceive in his stupidity and boorishness as a result of his self-delusion. Hatred, revenge, retaliation, jealousy, envy, penal laws, war and terror, politics, philosophies, any ideologies, gavolt, one murder and manslaughter, etc. are the superficial causes by which the human beings are afflicted. But they repress this and do not become aware of it because they imagine themselves to be good people through their delusion of God, and in this sense camouflage their face as a good man mask. While deep in their character all evil is lurking and only waiting to break out and cause mischief. This is precisely the case when something unsuitable for them has an external effect on their thought-feeling psychic world, and causes them to go berserk uncontrollably, to act maliciously and to rage, be it in this respect also only a word, a touch or a movement, an opinion, an action or a remark by another human being, a breath of wind, a breeze, a weather condition, a picture, a natural event, or anything else of all the thousands of possibilities that can arise, whereby the human being snaps, drops his religious believing good man mask, and violently translates his evil, deeply buried character outwards into action, up to and including murder. This is the case with practically all religious and delusional human beings, be they Protestants or Catholics, who are addicted to the mendacious Christian faith and who, in their delusion, arrogantly hold themselves in higher esteem than other human beings who believe differently or are free of a faith. Perhaps there are only a few exceptions, but they can be counted on one hand. The same lousy phenomenon occurs in principle with individual human beings, whereby, however, the majority of all delusional believers in God must be emphasized, because they adhere to confused teachings that preach contradictions and force the believers to believe that they are better if they would accept and display the nonsense of the faith. What is not taught, however, is that the human being must fundamentally evolve in every respect into true human beinghood in order to one day effectively become a real, true human being who frees himself from all evil and wrong and from all violence and lack of character. This, however, applies to all human beings, but especially to those who believe in the delusion of God, who think they have to work up their entire character to righteous values and to fight against and discard all negative unvalues. In this respect, not only the atheists, world believers, philosophy believers, politicians, rulers, religionists of all kinds, as well as the military and believers of all kinds of ideologies are affected, but the entire earth humans. In particular, however, the delusional believers in God should be mentioned, who as a rule, without being aware of it themselves, live on the one hand in a more or less strange form of fanaticism, but on the other hand, which they also do not consciously realize, in fear of God's punishments if they were to violate the lying deceptions of the alleged laws and recommendations of God. This is especially true of the delusionists of all faiths, be they believers in Christianity, believers in Allah in Islam, believers in Buddhism, Shintoism, Confucianism, Judaism, Hinduism, or believers in all other religions and sects, which today cast a spell over earthly humanity with over 700 faiths. Religions and sects, philosophies, atheism and worldviews, political insanity, militarism, left-wing and right-wing extremism, as well as all kinds of insane ideologies fundamentally convey evil Gewalt, while one death, destruction, and ruin. This violence, however, is generally exercised in a completely degenerate manner by the individual human being without thought and mercilessly and uncontrollably as soon as he snaps and drops his do-gooder mask. In a flash, all empty religious sectarian platitudes about love, peace, harmony, righteousness, nonviolence, and humanity are dropped and disappear like smoke and mirrors. This is also the case with all criminal family clans, organizations, gangs, motorbike gangs, and murderous terrorists which have degenerated equally wickedly in terms of their actions and deeds and contaminate everything around, whereby the complete degeneration of earthly human beings continues steadily and finds no end until every single human being finally frees himself from his stupidity and turns to the effective real reality and its truth. The absolute majority of earthlings keep themselves from becoming true human beings by means of the lies of the elements that lead them to believe, whereby earthly humanity has become a gigantic herd of hypocrites and moral degenerates who, in order to satisfy their desires, lusts, addictions, and vices, and all character degenerations, walk over dead bodies. And if this earth human beinghood can fulfill its degenerations, then the individual human being does so in moral degeneracy and like an insidious evil monster, which gives itself the false appearance of peacefulness and contentment, harmony and righteousness, while it, however, revels in hatred, tortures, executes, murders, and beats to death, wages wars, exercises terror, and makes a passion of murdering, killing, destroying, annihilating, and exterminating in religious and sectarian delusions of faith through massacres. But the God-delusional earthlings are not aware of this fact, and are also not interested in becoming aware of it, because then they would have to give up their degenerations and become true human beings. In the world, within the earthlings, religion belief-based evil dominates rules in the form of an uncontrolled urge for Ausartung, to manslaughter, torture, hatred, Gewalt, one murder, lies, falsehood and fanaticism, etc. Just as since time immemorial the human beings are influenced and directed, controlled from the outside by a malevolent force that is urging for Ausartung and annihilation. This is why all the conquerors all over the world have also become murderers and mass murderers, because they have massacred, murdered or subjugated, enslaved, robbed of their treasures and destroyed their achievements all over the world in all the foreign countries they invaded and conquered. This, on the one hand, while many of the conquerors conquered and annexed the populations of those countries, they robbed and exploited for their native kings. On the other hand, for their delusion of religion and for their religious rulers, they forced the populations of the conquered countries to a delusion alien to them through torture, fear, and terror. But if the natives of the conquered countries did not bow and accept the foreign delusion of God, then they were simply tortured, massacred, and murdered by the conquerors and their henchmen, as was the custom. And there were many such mass murderers among the conquerors, such as Columbus, who became a mass murderer and genocideer in the newly discovered world of America, but this is usually publicly concealed, as was also the case with many others who are hailed to the skies for their deeds, etc., although their heroic actions were in fact the murder of natives of foreign countries. The same was also done by conquerors in various countries in Africa, New Zealand, Australia, and in various countries in Asia, Central America, and South America. And when the original America is considered, now called the United States of America, the conquerors and immigrants explicitly did the same thing, through partial or total exterminations of native Indian peoples and Indian tribes. And in this respect, the culprits were immigrants and their descendants who, coming mainly from Europe, conquered the Americas through bloody wars and by almost completely exterminating the native inhabitants. Immigrants from Germany, Scotland, Ireland, England, France, Austria, Italy, Scandinavia, and Switzerland were particularly prominent, with large numbers being deported from their home countries to America by the authorities as criminals and other undesirable elements. Going further in my speech, I must also make it clear that overpopulation is also the crux of much further disaster that will occur in the times to come, increasing everything into worse and worse forms. But nothing will be done about it because those irresponsible people in the governments are incapable of governing, who should do the right thing, but are incapable of doing it. And those few in the governments who would know what to do, and would also do it if they did not have to dance to the tune of the government incompetence, on the one hand do not find the courage to act, and on the other hand they are disregarded and held down. That is why no government is taking action against the current and approaching disaster, but is only fabulating for themselves and their own good. While the mass overpopulation continues to increase, and further disaster will result from degenerated destruction, extermination, and even more dangerous climate destruction. Therefore, the result is that everything is getting worse and worse, because the more human beings populate the world, the more strife, hatred, jealousy, murders, terror, killings, nuclear power plants, epidemics, diseases, wars, criminality, religious murderous fanaticism, and crimes, etc., begin to rule the world more and more, as well as more and more comprehensively. A small and earth-adapted humanity, however, would not bring about all these degenerations, just as it would not need and would never manufacture and produce nuclear power stations, huge motorways and airports, and everything else that is exuberant. Everything that destroys all ecosystems and even the planet by degenerating needs, lusts, and desires, and by irresponsible demands for luxury, etc., would not be. There would also be no huge armies, no uncontrollable drug smuggling, drug use, and no gigantic arms production, and no associated huge arms trade, as well as no worldwide murderous, commercial, and religion fanatic and state-supported criminal organizations. There would also be no humanity crime, criminal actions, and behavior in the way that Hitler, Stalin, and other war criminals and humanity criminals displayed. But there would also be no criminally impregnated USA with its world hegemony delusion and its actions with war and terror, subjugation of states, as well as infamous underhandedness and unjustified interference in foreign countries' affairs. Consequently, there would also be no worldwide chaos full of terror, mass murder, population murder, very numerous wars, war crimes, destruction and annihilation all over the world, as all this has been caused and spread around the world by the USA. And in this regard, the fact is that through the fault of the USA, endless chaos, strife, riots, murder and manslaughter, manifold violence, crimes and hatred, disharmony, destruction and mass calamity are rampant all over the world today, where US America had and still has its dirty fingers in the pie. I wanted to have this said clearly once more, with which I have once again said what is on my stomach with my monologue.
However, what you have listed is, as I know, only a part of the whole. What moves you, what you see, judge, and elaborate absolutely correctly. Consequently, I can only agree with you. This is also the reason that I do not interrupt your speaking, explaining, and expounding, for if you did not call the facts by their names, then I myself would feel compelled to expound them, because there is a necessity for it, and it is imperative that it be spoken of and the truth be stated. As my father Svath has conditionally taught you for the sake of the dissemination of the facts, as I have always known. He has taught you to deliver such monologues as you call your remarks, which correspond to an art of speech that must be learned for a long time and must be extremely informative and comprehensive and based on truthful facts and information. The whole thing also requires proper and deep concentration and all the necessary knowledge.
You may well be right, Ptah, but we do not need to talk about that, because once something is learnt and it is used again and again, it is normal and nothing special to keep in practice.
Of course, but now, Edward, it is getting late and I must go unless you have something of importance that needs to be addressed.
No, I do not. Then I bid you goodbye, dear friend. Farewell, Ptah, and see you soon. Now I'll look up the description of the Messel pit on the internet and add it to the end of our conversation.
That will be good. Goodbye, Edward, my friend.
Messel pit. The Messel pit in Messel, southeast of the Messel district of the same name, in the district of Darmstadt-Dieburg in Hesse, is a disused open-cast oil shale mine. Because of the outstanding quality of the Eocene fossils recovered there, it was designated a UNESCO World Natural Heritage Site in 1995. So far, representatives of all vertebrate groups as well as insects and plants have been found there. The best-known representatives of the Messel fauna are probably the two early horse-like species, Propalaeotherium and Eurohippus, of which over 70 individuals have been excavated so far. Other important finds are the crane bird Messalornis cristata and Darwinius massillae ida, an early primate. History. From the beginnings until 1970, the mining history of the Messel mine began in 1859 with the construction of a turf iron ore pit. During the mining of the ore, the lignite-like sedimentation horizons of Lake Messel were encountered, which were also initially mined. Eventually, oil shale was encountered, which was the main focus of mining operations until the mine was closed in 1971. The oil shale was mined from the 1880s onwards by the Messel Trade Union, which was founded for this purpose, and smoldered in the immediate vicinity of the mine for the extraction of petroleum products. Various railway systems existed for transporting the mining products from the mine and the waste products from the smoldering process to the dumps. As early as 1876, an alligator skeleton, Crocodilus ebertsi, was found during the first attempts to mine oil shale, and in 1898, Ernst Wittich published the first more comprehensive scientific treatise on the Messel mine in his dissertation in Gießen. In 1912, the then Grosser Zogliches Landesmuseum Darmstadt was granted the rights to fossil finds from the Messel oil shale. In 1923, the Messel mine became the property of Stinnes Riebecksche Montan und Ölwerke AG, from 1925 part of IG Farben. In 1945, the plant, which had been badly damaged in the Second World War, was confiscated by the US military administration and placed under the control of the IG Farben Central Office in Frankfurt am Main, which was entrusted with the liquidation of IG Farben. 9 years later, in 1954, the Paraffin- und Mineralölwerk Messel GmbH was founded, which received the mining rights to the mine from the state of Hesse. In 1959, the GmbH was taken over by the Swedish Ytong Group, which processed the smoldering waste from the oil shale there into aerated concrete blocks. In 1962, mineral oil extraction, which had become increasingly unprofitable, was discontinued, and oil shale was only mined in relatively small quantities from then on. 1970, 1990, landfill or excavation site. Even before the final end of industrial oil shale mining, the Messel pit was chosen as a suitable location for a central waste disposal site for southern Hesse. The reason for this was, on the one hand, its size, and on the other, its central location in the Rhine-Main region. The fact that the construction of such a landfill would inevitably have led to the end of fossil excavations did not play a major role in these considerations, especially since even scientists at the time did not consider the Messel oil shale to be of exceptionally high value in this respect. It was only after the end of industrial oil shale mining in 1971 that private fossil collectors made sensational finds, and the underestimated potential of the mine became increasingly clear. In 1974, the Zweckverband Abfallbeseitigung Gruber Messel Zagum was founded. In the same year, the pit was closed to the public. In 1975, at its own insistence, the Senckenberg Research Institute was granted excavation participation in the pit, whereupon regular excavations have been carried out ever since. In 1976, the Senckenberg paleontologist Jens Franzen published an essay in which he attested to the outstanding importance of the Messel fossils. In 1977, the ZAGM applied for planning approval from the Hessian Chief Mining Office regarding the large-scale landfill. Because of the now obvious high scientific value of the pit, the Senckenberg researchers objected to the planning approval application at the Upper Mining Authority in 1979, but allowed themselves to be placated by the then Hessian Minister-President Holger Borner with the guarantee that the west slope of the pit, which is particularly rich in fossils, would remain open for excavations for another 20 years. After the Upper Mining Authority had approved the construction and operation of the landfill by zoning decision in 1981, construction work began the following year. In 1984, after an SPD minority government tolerated by the Greens took office, all previous decisions on the Messel pit landfill had been made by a social liberal coalition, the new Environment Minister Armin Klaus, under pressure from the Greens, ordered a halt to construction in Messel. The operator, meanwhile renamed Zweckverband Abfallbeseitigung Sudessen Saas, however, sued against this before the Hessian Administrative Court and was proven right, whereupon construction work was resumed. 2 years after the 1983 state elections, the Greens officially entered the Hessian state government in 1985. In view of the legal situation, the Red-Green government applied to the Chief Mines Inspectorate the following year to suspend the zoning decision at least with regard to the commissioning of the landfill. After a CDU-led government took over in Hesse in the spring of 1987, however, this application was withdrawn, whereupon the Messel Citizens Initiative to prevent the landfill, which had already formed in the 1970s and had unsuccessfully brought several lawsuits against the mine, filed an emergency petition against the landfill. In December 1987, due to formal errors in the planning approval procedure and new expert opinions on the safety of the landfill, it was granted justice, which was confirmed in the main proceedings in November 1988. Although an appeal of these proceedings was allowed before the Federal Administrative Court, the Hessian Ministry of the Environment and the ZAS finally abandoned their plans for the Messel pit landfill, partly because improvements to the landfill planning would have cost about 300 million marks. By then, the project had already cost 65 million marks. From 1990, declaration as a UNESCO World Natural Heritage Site. After the mine was bought by the state of Hesse in 1991 for 32.6 million marks, it transferred the operation of the mine to the Senckenberg Natural Research Society, which has since been mining oil shale there for scientific purposes, officially under mining law conditions. In the meantime, the Messel pit had risen to become a world-class fossil deposit due to numerous finds of unique quality, which is why the Hessian Ministry of Science and Art applied to UNESCO in 1994 to have the Messel pit inscribed on the World Heritage List. On the 8th of December 1995, it was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site under the entry Messel Pit Fossil Site. In 2004, a fossil python from the oil shale, Paleopithon fischeri, was named in honor of Joschka Fischer, who as Hesse's environment minister had campaigned against the pit being used as a landfill site and had signed the contract for the purchase of the pit by the state of Hesse in 1991. In 1997, a viewing platform was built on the southern edge of the pit, and guided tours for visitors began, but it was not until 13 years later that the visitor center opened. On the 9th of December 2010, those 55 residents of the community of Messel who had filed a lawsuit against the construction of the landfill were honored. On the occasion of the ceremony marking the 15th anniversary of the site's inscription on the World Heritage List, these persons were awarded for their commendable civic commitment, with honorary cards granting them free access to the visitor center for life. Geological setting. The Messel pit is located on the northern extension of the Odenwald Plateau, the so-called Sprendlinger Horst. The Odenwald and Sprendlinger Horst together form the northern part of the eastern rift shoulder of the Upper Rhine Graben. While the Variscan basement emerges in the crystalline Odenwald, which is classified here as part of the Central German crystalline sill, it is predominantly covered by deposits of the Rotliegend Lower Permian on the Sprendlinger Horst. The sediments of the Messel pit Messel Formation form an isolated Eocene deposit in the midst of these Rotliegend sediments. History of the Messel pit. Early phase. The rocks on which the Messel Eocene sediments rest were formed as early as the Paleozoic era, over 300 million years ago. Some of these are granitoid plutons that were formed during the late phase of the Variscan mountain building in the Upper Carboniferous, and some are even older. Mostly originally igneous rocks that were sunk deep into the Earth's crust during the mountain building and were transformed there as a result of the high pressure and temperature G. Amphibolite. As a result of the erosion of the Variscan high mountains, sedimentary layers of erosion debris, so-called molasse, were deposited in basins inside the mountains and in the mountain foothills at the end of the Carboniferous and in the course of the Permian. In Central Europe today, this varicid molasse is generally summarized under the term Rotliegend. In the Messel area, it is the so-called mored strata of the Upper Rotliegend. In the Mesozoic, the Rotliegend molasse was overlain by other sediments, including the sandstones and mudstones of the Buntsandstein Lower Triassic, which are found today southeast and east of the Darmstadt area, in the Sandstein Odenwald and in the Sandstein Spessart. Origin of the oil shale. The history of the Messel oil shale begins about 48 million years ago in the Eocene. As a result of plate tectonics, Europe was at a slightly shorter distance from the equator, and the average global temperature was significantly higher than today. The formation of the Alps triggered geodynamic processes in and below the crust of Central Europe, which led, among other things, to the subsidence of the Upper Rhine Graben and the uplift of the Black Forest Odenwald Plateau, including the Sprendlinger Horst. As a result of the erosion of the uppermost parts of the uplifted flows, the Variscan basement was exposed in the Black Forest and the western Odenwald. In the less strongly uplifted Sprendlinger Horst, erosion only occurred as far as the Rotliegend. Associated with the tectonic movements was the formation of volcanic foci. A research borehole drilled in autumn 2001 revealed that there was also such a volcanic hearth in the Messel area. From there, basaltic magma rose towards the Earth's surface and hit groundwater, triggering a violent steam explosion. This explosion occurred less than 100 meters below the Earth's surface at the time, and not only blew a deep crater into the landscape, but also disrupted the surrounding rock. This allowed water to penetrate in the direction of the volcanic hearth, and the next steam explosion then occurred at a correspondingly greater depth. Repeating this process several times created an explosion funnel more than 700 meters deep in the bedrock. According to a study published at the end of 2014, these explosions occurred between 48.49 and 47.89 million years ago. While the lower part of the funnel contains rock debris breccias and tuff, the uppermost 200 to 300 meters filled with water after the volcanism subsided and a maar lake formed. Various sediments were subsequently deposited in this lake, mainly the bituminous mudstone that is known today as Messel oil shale. The generally warm climate and the small seasonal temperature fluctuations, together with the very great depth of the lake in relation to the surface, prevented water exchange by convection. This inevitably leads to a lack of oxygen, as well as a high sulfur content in the deeper water layers. Due to these euxinic conditions in the depths of the maar, a putrid sludge formed, which provided the best conditions for fossil preservation of dead animals and plants that reached the bottom of the lake. In the course of the following millions of years, this mud condensed into a black claystone, also black perlite, the oil shale. The oil shale deposits have a thickness of up to 150 meters, which suggests a depositional period of around 1.5 million years. Petrography of the oil shale. The rather mining term oil shale is, from a petrological point of view, inaccurate in two respects. Firstly, it is not shale, as it is not a rock whose slaty structure has tectonic causes, and secondly, the rock does not contain petroleum, but solid carbon-rich compounds, so-called kerogens. This material is a precursor of crude oil, from which crude oil can only be extracted by a technical process called carbonization. The correct petrographic term is black perlite or black claystone. What is striking about oil shale is its fine lamination, that is to say, an alternating layering in the millimeter range. The Messel oil shale consists mainly of smectites. These are clay minerals that originate from the chemical weathering of basic volcanic rocks. Some of them were formed before they were washed into the lake, but some were also formed after the initial minerals olivine, pyroxenes, hornblende were deposited. The input probably occurred mainly through rainwater runoff, which washed smectites and their parent minerals from the slopes of the tough walls surrounding the lake and washed them into the lake. It is possible, however, that at least some of the source materials also entered the lake in the form of ash rain, originating from the eruptions of nearby volcanoes. Other mineral components are siderite, pyrite partly responsible for the dark color of the rock, quartz, opal, and zeolite. The high proportion of siderite, which is concentrated in yellowish-gray or orange layers laminae, less than 1 millimeter thick, is a special feature of the Messel oil shale. The sideritic layers are presumably due to the activity of siderophilic protozoa algae, which proliferated on the lake floor when the iron content of the water increased. Algae are also the source of the majority, about 80%, of the organic components of the oil shale, the kerogens. The most common algal species is tetraedron minimum. Much of the lamination of the Messel oil shale corresponds to the alternating layering of particularly organic-rich with clay-rich layers. This is explained by the fact that the algae proliferated particularly strongly in the drier, sunnier months of the year and sank to the lake floor after their death. In the rainier half of the year, alluvium and deposition of clay minerals predominated. If this hypothesis is correct, the lamination of the oil shale would be a true warp stratification. Since the sedimentation rate of mineral matter was naturally stronger at the edges of the lake, the proportion of organic matter in the oil shale of the marginal areas of the pit is correspondingly lower marginal shale. Lamination is also not as pronounced there. About 19% of the organic matter comes from higher terrestrial plants, and only 1% comes from animals, whereby here again microorganisms, zooplankton, make up by far the largest proportion. Fossils general. The fossil finds from the Messel pit are very extensive and include not only plants but also invertebrates and vertebrates. More than 75 families with over 200 species are known from plants alone, which are present as micro and macro fossils. Among the vertebrates, a good 130 taxa have been identified so far, including over 40 species from more than 30 genera of mammals alone. Numerous taxa received their first description with fossil material from Messel. The state of preservation of the fossils embedded in the oil shale is excellent. In the case of vertebrates, stomach contents or details of the soft tissues are occasionally preserved, and in the case of insects, the veining of the wings or the original coloring of the chitinous shell. Such information is usually lost during fossilization. The Senckenberg Nature Museum in Frankfurt and the Hessian State Museum in Darmstadt regularly carry out excavations during the summer months. There is a conservation problem with the fossils from the Messel pit. The load-bearing material, the claystone oil shale, contains about 40% water. If it dries out, it cracks and disintegrates into small flakes, similar to bark mulch. It was only in the early 1960s that it became possible to embed the fossils on synthetic resin epoxy resin, or polyester resin, and thus preserve them permanently. Preserve them for research and exhibit them. The process was developed by hobby researchers in the 1970s to the form still used today, as private salvage of oil shale was tolerated by the authorities until 1974. The reburial procedure. In order to protect the Messel vertebrate fossils in the long term from damage or destruction as a result of the oil shale drying out in the air, they are separated from the oil shale and preserved in several steps. Using fine tools, scalpel, or dissecting needle, overlying rock debris on the cleavage surface of the oil shale, where parts of the skeleton are already exposed, is removed until approximately 1/2 the top of the skeleton is completely exposed. Around the exposed fossil, a 2 to 3 centimeter high frame G, made of plasticine, is placed on the rock slab in such a way that a kind of shallow trough is created, the bottom of which is formed by the oil shale together with the skeleton still half embedded in it. The skeleton is dried with a hot air blower until it is a little lighter than the surrounding rock. Meanwhile, the slab is wrapped in plastic film to keep the oil shale moist. After the foil has been removed, liquid synthetic resin is poured into the frame until the skeleton is covered with a layer no more than 1 centimeter thick. The resin needs about 12 hours to harden. The frame is then removed. The plate can now be turned over, and the underside of the skeleton, which is firmly attached to the resin, can be freed from the remaining oil shale using suitable tools. Findings in vertebrates. Although Messel used to be a lake, hardly any aquatic invertebrates are found. Freshwater shrimps, snails such as the marsh-cap snail viviparus, and piston water beetles are only found in certain oil shale layers. Land-dwelling insects are much more common. Dung beetles, jewel beetles, and weevils dominate. Some specimens even still have remnants of paint. The same is also true for a green widder from the family Zygaenidae, where the coloration of the wings could be determined. Other insects are represented by representatives of the leafcutter bees, large representatives of the grasshoppers, and by song cicadas. A special find is a walking leaf of the genus Eophilium, which already closely resembled its present-day relatives. Flying insects are represented by bipeds from the family Nemestrinidae, including Hymenura and Hymenoptera. The latter includes the true bees, which have been recorded in Messel with Pygomelissa and Protobombus. Furthermore, various parasitic representatives of the ichneumon flies occur, including Trigonata, Mesonatus, Polyelictes, Ricella, and Xanthopimpla. Some of the forms such as Mesonatus or Polyhelictes cannot be precisely assigned systematically, but Trigonata belongs to the Labeninae, which are actually a faunal element of the southern continents Africa, South America, and Australia. Ants are mainly represented only by queens and flying males. Among them, weaver ants were found as well as the largest ant species ever. The queens of the genus Titanomyrma, with the species Titanomyrma gigantea, have a wingspan of up to 16 centimeters. Also interesting is the discovery of the parasitic fungus Orpheocordyceps unilateralis, which specializes in ants. Fish, the most common fish species in Messel, are original ray-finned fish, of which 3 species have been discovered in Messel: the mudfish Cyclurus carreri and the bony pikes Macelosteus kelleri and Atractosteus kinkelini, formerly A. straussi. Rarer are modern ray-finned fishes Teleostae, such as the salmon-like Thaumaturus intermedius, the eel Anguilla ignota, and the 3 perch-like Amphiperca multiformis, Paleoperca proxima, and Renanoperca minuta. Amphibians. In addition to the terrestrial toad frog Eopelobates wagneri, representatives of the extinct family Paleobatrachidae, and the salamander Chelotriton robustus were also discovered in Messel. Reptiles. The turtles are represented in Messel by the pond turtle Palaeoemis, from which Euroemis is sometimes separated, Aleocalis, which belongs to the Papuan soft-shelled turtles, the soft-shelled turtle Palaeoamida, and the neck-turning turtle Neocalis. Noteworthy here are several individuals of Aleocalis found in pairs, each representing male and female individuals. Some of the pairs are in direct body contact with each other and have their tails placed against each other as if in the mating position, which is interpreted accordingly as a sexual act. The finds are thus among the oldest fossilized evidence of copulation in vertebrates. The crocodilians of the Messel Formation are represented both by more primitive, albeit relatively specialized forms, and also by more modern forms. The former include Pristichampsus rollinatii and Bergisuchus dietrichbergi, which were most likely pure land dwellers. In contrast, the Diplocynodontids Diplocynodon darwini and Barifracta deponiae, which are related to the alligators and caimans. The alligators Haseacosuchus haupti, formerly Alognathosuchus haupti, and Alognathosuchus gracilis, and the Arceatosuchus germanicus, which is related to the true crocodiles, lived mainly in water. The snakes of the Messel Eocene all belong to the rolling snakes and giant snakes, which are considered rather primitive. The giant snakes are represented, among others, by sand boas, as well as the up to 2-meter-long Paleopithon fischeri, and the smaller species Messelophis variatus and M. ermanorum. Uroloderma, an early representative of the crustacean lizards, and Cryptolacerta, a representative of the twin snake lizards Lacertibania, have been found in Messel. The long-tailed lizards Eolacerta and Stephanicia are also close to the true lizards. The former form reached a body length of about 27 centimeters. The latter was only about half as long. Other finds include Placosauriops and Ophiosauruscus from the group of creepers. Here, Shinosaurus also belongs to the closer relatives. At present, there is only one discarded tail, whose scale armor resembles that of the Chinese crocodile-tailed lizard. This is not only the first record of the genus in the European Paleogene, but also the earliest record of such a crocodile-like tail of this lizard group. Like the Chinese crocodile-tailed lizard, which is highly endangered today, the Messel counterpart was probably also water-dwelling. Furthermore, Ornithocephalus was a large-headed lizard, Geisel an iguana, and Sanewa, possibly a member of the monitor lizards. Birds, ground-dwelling birds at Messel, included the ratite Paleotis weigeltii, the henbird Para ortigoides messelensis, the 2-meter-high goose relative Gastornis cf. Geiselensis, the Messel rail, Messelornis cristata, the Seriema relatives Idionis, Strigogyps formerly Enigmavis, and Salmilla robusta. Water birds are rare. Only a relative of the flamingos and grebes, Juncitasus mercalli, the ibis Rhynchiites messelensis, and the pelican Masilostega rectirostris have been described so far. Tree breeders included the day dormouse Parapraefica kelleri, the Messel hoopoe Messelirissa, the swifts Paragornis messelensis, and Scania cypselus sarski, the parrots Pseudasturides macrocephalus, and Cerudoptes poli, the rough Eocoraceus brachyptera, the raptor Messelasta gratulator, the kingfisher Quasisyndactylus longibrachis, the cuckoo rail Plesiocathartes kelleri, the swallowbird Hassiovis laticauda, various owl species, mousebirds, and the bird Eurofluvioviridavus. With Eofringilirostrum and Psittacopes, early representatives of the passerine bird family could also be documented. The former probably fed on hard-shelled seeds due to its finch-like beak, while the beak of the latter resembles that of today's bearded tit. Primazygodactylus is also closely related to the two genera. Mammals. The marsupials found in Messel so far include the genera Mimaperadectes, Amphiperitherium, Peritherium, and Paradectes. They are distant relatives of the tree-dwelling marsupials that live in America today. The majority belong to the higher mammals. Insectivores are represented by the hedgehog relatives Pholidocercus, Macrocranion 2 species, and the bipedal Leptictidium 3 species. Rodents include the 1-meter-long Ailurovus, the Messel mice Macillamis and Hartenbergeramis, and the dormouse Eoglyravus. The primitive Copidodon, reminiscent of modern insectivores. The apatomid Heteroheus, a mammal resembling the pinniped, and the pangolins Eomanis, Euromanis, and Eurotamandua, the latter originally classified as an anteater, lived in trees. The lemurs have survived mainly in fragments, including several species of Europolymer. However, there is also one of the most complete skeletons of Darwinius, first described as Godinosia, which became world-famous under the nickname Ida. In contrast, Buxolestes, a representative of the Pantalestidae, lived like an otter. Predatory mammals are very rare in Messel. So far, only 3 genera have been discovered. Lesmesodon belongs to the so-called pseudo or primitive predators Creodonta, while Parodectes and Messelogale are placed among the modern predators Carnivora. Bats, which belong to at least 3 different families, show a remarkably high diversity. The most important and most common are the representatives of the genus Paleocheiropteryx, which were specialized insectivores. Tachypteron and Hasionecteris are less common. Of the herbivorous odd-toed ungulates, 5 genera have already been described in Messel. The Tapa relative Hieracius, which has been preserved with a complete skeleton, is the largest known mammal in Messel. It shared its habitat with the prehistoric Hallensia, Propaleotherium and Eurohippus. The latter two genera each represent several species and together comprise over 70 skeletons. Their systematic position within the horse relatives is not entirely clear, as a reference to the Palaheridae as well as to the Equidae is discussed. Lophiodon, a more distant relative of the tapirs, is represented by the skeleton of a young animal. Even-toed ungulates, in contrast to odd-toed ungulates, are rarer in Messel, but occur with at least 4 genera: Messelabunodon, Aumalasia, Macilabune, Datenwees, and Urodexis. Soft tissues. In addition to the bacterially caused tracing of body outlines, fur and feathers, structures reminiscent of blood cells and bone cells, have been found in the turtles Aleoclis and Neocalis, the crocodile Diplocynodon, and the pangolin Euromanis, among others. Some fossils excavated by private collectors in the 1970s and 80s were later sold on. For example, the holotype of Darwinius macilli, which became known to the public as Ida in May 2009, was acquired by the Natural History Museum in Oslo for a 6-figure sum. Since at the time of the fossil discovery the pit was owned by the Svekverband Abfallbeseitigung Sudessen Zias, see history, corresponding claims were made by ZS. The then managing director declared in July 2009 that he would subsequently claim what we are entitled to, as he had always assumed that the finds were excavated exclusively for scientific purposes.